Battle for Dawn, a science fiction adventure. Robot Empire Book 2. By Kevin Partner. 1. Core. Report. We have been unable to re-establish communication with Radiant 138, designation Vulturn. Terminal signals indicate sudden attack of a force unknown. Humans. Unlikely given source vector. Elaborate. Terminal Mayday signal included trajectory plot of weapon or weapons, indicating that they did not originate from the vicinity of the local sun. Conclusion: unknown FTL technology. Point of origin calculated to be within the globular cluster designated Sagittarius Dwarf Elliptical Galaxy, though this is considered speculative at present. Continue. Further trajectory analysis suggests this might account for previously reported loss of communication with Outpost Radiant 137. Purpose of attacker. Theory. Unknown. Units dispatched to Vulturn to investigate have not yet reported. However, hostile intent obvious. Ultimate objective. Insufficient data. Speculate. Extrapolating vector from first attack would bring the weapon near to core space, assuming a reasonable margin for error. Timeframe. Insufficient data. Speculate. Assuming current velocity, weapon will enter core space within 60 days. And the humans. No reports. Our agent. In place. Dawn. Located. Set fleet in defensive mode. Protect core. Expedite report from Vulturn. Expedite Project Dawn. Acknowledged. Core executive disengaging. Acknowledged. We are the Radiants. Protect, enlighten, obey. We are core. 2. Relics. Incredible. Lucius stood with his boots anchored to the floor of the central observation gallery, gazing out at the valleys below and above. They were shrouded in mist, but the greens and blues of farmland and rivers could be glimpsed through the shifting clouds. Arla smiled and looked across at Hal, who stood open-mouthed at the sight. He was to all appearances his old self again. Arla had found him standing quite still and in control of his motor functions when she'd left the airlock with a puzzled Debussy and Kiama, along with Lucius and his 2 colleagues. Her first act had been to get Dr. McCall to examine the 3 newcomers as well as Hal, and this had delayed their exit for long enough to see the swift departure of the transport through the airlock window. As soon as they'd been past fit and devoid of any known viruses, Arla had decided that they would be brought inside, but that no further crew members would be exposed to them until any reasonable incubation period had passed. There were such things as unknown viruses, after all. As for Hal, he had no memory of the period during which Ace had been in charge, though he readily admitted that he'd allowed the AI to occupy his implant. Arla had spoken to him out of earshot of the newcomers. For now at least, she didn't want them to know that the AI they sought was within arm's reach. Not that she harbored any particular doubts about the veracity of Lucius' asylum request. He really would have needed to be a puppet master of extraordinary ability to orchestrate the chaotic mix of panic and threats Arla had been subjected to by Captain Indy of Relentless, and latterly, the Vanis home planet. All she knew for certain was that Relentless was limping home, its weapons useless and its drives crippled, and that all other ships had been quarantined in case of cross-infection. For now they were safe, but they probably only had a matter of days or at best weeks to prepare for a full assault or to escape somehow. And these people remained completely ignorant of their true situation. That they're on a spaceship, not some sort of weird cylindrical planet, Lucius said with a mixture of amazement and perhaps just a touch of contempt. Arla felt her hackles rising. Yes, the deception was well implemented. Everyone in the crew once believed the same thing, and I don't think we can be considered complete idiots. Indeed, Lucius said, bowing. Who is to say what anyone would believe if fed a convincing enough lie from birth? I apologize. Accepted. Now the problem is that if it comes to a fight. Which it will, interrupted Bex. Then those people below are our army. Lucius turned away from the window and stood with half his face illuminated by the glow of dawn's sun, and the other half in darkness. You made the transition. How long did that take? 6 months is allowed for crew acclimatization and basic education, Arla said. We don't have 6 months, Bex growled. As soon as that low-life Indie gets relentless repaired, he'll be down on us like a snake in a rabbit hole. A rabbit hole with all the exits blocked, added Lucius. But if we're not very careful, we'll end up with a civil war on our hands, Kiama added grimly. Arla shrugged. So it's either insurrection or invasion. Nice choice. There is no choice, Captain, Lucius said. Your people, ignorant though they are, constitute our only chance of resisting what must come. What's the point in resisting, though? We can't defend ourselves indefinitely against the entire resources of the Vanis Federation. Beck smiled. We don't need to. All we have to do is keep them at bay for long enough to reach the gate, then we jump away to a random destination. We're not fools, Kiama scoffed. We know they can follow us unless we make several quick jumps. We also know that the main reason the Empire collapsed was because humans can't do the calculations quickly enough to achieve this. Where did you learn this? Lucius snapped, rounding on Kiama, his face grim. Never you mind, Arla said. He's right though, isn't she? You can't jump far enough to get away from a determined pursuit. Navigator Bex and Technician Naresh Kumar were brought into my conspiracy because they are, respectively, the best navigator and the ablest programmer in the Federation. If anyone can plot a multiple-point jump, it's them. Now, I suggest we plan our next move. Arla detached herself from the rail, deactivated her mag boots, and began floating toward the open door of the chute. You plan if you want to. I'm going to ask for advice from the wisest person I know. Who is? I'm going to see my father. 3. Farmer. Arla stood behind the edge of the world and looked down at herself. She was wearing the clothes of the valley folk and was about to step through a hidden door back into the only world she'd known for the first 15 years of her life. She had the weird momentary impression that the past 5 years, her indoctrination into the priesthood, she'd have to deal with them sooner or later, and her training as an engineer hadn't happened. She was again a farmer's daughter, ready to stride through the familiar fields or hide from RDJ. Debussy had come down to valley level with her, as the door was locked from the inside. It was rarely used, and if Arla had ever seen a bank vault, she'd have said it looked just like this. The engineers occasionally carried out emergency repairs in the Chamber of the Valleys, but these were done at night after curfew, and Arla wanted to arrive as an ordinary person, not one of the mythical guardian angels. Debussy glanced again at the video feed from the other side. Clear, he said. This was not surprising, since a taboo had been put on the end of the valley to keep the unusually curious at bay. Their religion taught that on the other side of the rock face, the side where Arla waited, lay the realm of the blessed engineers, and that to see it was to die. Okay, she said, let's go. With a grunt, Debussy heaved on the wheel lock. After a moment's resistance, something gave within the mechanism, and it began to turn smoothly. Arla had chosen to travel by night, so all she could see as the door opened was a slowly widening circle of blackness. She activated her torch and stepped through. Good luck, Skip, Debussy whispered as she went. She put her hand on his shoulder as she passed. Thanks, Jack. Don't forget to keep someone on duty down here in case I need to leave in a hurry. Sure thing. Not such an idiot after all, thought Arla. Debussy, it seemed, was one of the few people capable of abandoning a point of view in the face of evidence without the slightest rancor or regret. They were going to need more like him in the coming days. She stepped onto the shingle, her feet sinking and the stones sounding dangerously loud. But apart from the pebbles as she moved and the murmur of a warm nighttime breeze, she heard nothing as she slid back into the valley, a zephyr in the dark. After an hour's careful scrambling in the near-total darkness, her only guide the wobbling circle of torchlight, Arla caught her first sight of settlement. Unless she deviated wildly from her intended course directly astern, this should be Periphery Delta. She'd never visited it before, but she knew that PD was a pumping station used to circulate water from the oceans into the fields and wells of the North Valley. The station would be sparsely crewed, so it ought to be simple enough to slip past it in the dark and find the highway that led toward the more densely populated Central Belt. "May I be of service?" Arla froze, then relaxed. The voice was unmistakably that of a robot. Not one of those fake humans masquerading as officers back in the command module, but a genuine honest-to-goodness machine made of metal and plastic. She turned her torch toward the noise, and the beam soon found the legs, then torso, then head of a robot. Her first impression was that it was short and stocky, like a fat child of a dozen years or so. Then, as her beam played across its surface, she saw how damaged it was. Its body was a patchwork of dents, rust, and flakes of peeling paint. "Designation," Arla said. There was a small clanking sound, as of gears turning, and it spoke. "I am RXL-2006. Who may I be addressing?" "My name is Arla Farmer," she responded. She decided to use her real name, since no one in the valleys had any idea that this was also the name of the captain. "Mistress Farmer, may I be of service? There are no farms in this location, and I fear you might be lost." "Do not be concerned," Arla said. "I know my way." "But what is your function?" "You are damaged." "I am sorry, mistress. My function is to clean and repair the drainage systems of Station Periphery Delta. There has been much to do in recent times, and no opportunity to be taken offline for repair." "Recent times? When were you last sent for maintenance?" "I was last offline 8,904 days ago, mistress." Arla performed a mental calculation that the robot could have completed in a fraction of the time it took her. But there was such a thing as pride, after all. That's over 24 years. "You've been running continually since before I was born." "Yes, mistress. I hope I have given satisfactory service in that time." "I'm sure you have," Arla said. "Now, can you show me the way to the highway?" "That would be useful." "I would be glad to, mistress. I have completed my latest task, and have time before I am required." Arla fell into step beside the squat, rusted machine as it thudded clumsily along on its stumpy legs, like some clockwork tick-tock out of Legends. RXL proved to be a reliable guide, and they found the path easily enough as daylight came to dawn. Arla found herself unaccountably sad to bid farewell to the little robot, and suppressed the lump in her throat as she turned back to see him plodding mechanically back to his work. Some people might call it slavery. Could machines be enslaved? She'd never considered it before, but since learning of the true nature of the officers and interacting with Ace, she began to see why a movement had arisen to give them free will. And what a disaster that had proven to be. Knowing what she now knew, would she have the courage to propose the same for the robots of Dawn? That was a discussion for a later time. The robots would be useless in any conflict, as they'd be bound by the 3 laws of robotics, and the matter of their civil liberties would have to wait until the current threat had been seen off. She laughed at herself for even thinking that. Who was she kidding? She was just a young woman with no experience leading an army of pitchfork wielders, and only if they agreed to follow her. What chance did they have? More, she decided, than if they did nothing. She had followed the main canal as it passed from the arid periphery into the breadbasket of the valley. To her left and right the fields and woods curved upwards into the distance to be lost in a blue that wasn't sky, but rather the seas that bordered and separated the valleys. She sucked in a lungful of air and relished the subtle smells of living things and the playing of the wind on her face as she walked along. She'd forgotten just how much she loved the simple pleasures of valley life, and began to dread returning to the sterile environment of the crew quarters with its plasticky, still air. As she trudged westward, more and more people emerged to get on with the business of the day. She was still some miles from her former home, so there was little danger she'd be recognized, but she raised her canvas hood as if to shelter her face from the warming sun above so she could gaze from the shadows. The solar tube that ran from one end of Dawn to the other took several hours to brighten to its maximum, simulating the natural rhythms of day and night. She wondered briefly why the designers had bothered with such subtleties when within a few decades of launch, there would have been no one left who remembered sunrise and sunset on a planet shaped like a globe. Within a few hours, she began to recognize the landscape and buildings she was walking through, and by noon, she'd entered the outskirts of the cereal fields bordering the Great Lake. On its shores lay the farm of her father and his wife. Yes, she was a problem. Arla had no desire to meet her stepmother again, not least because she didn't want her visit to become public knowledge, and Becca could be relied upon to blab about her at the first opportunity. RDJ was the key, and she found him tending to the sheep in the south pasture. She felt a warmth fill her as she trod the paths of home again, like a comforting blanket. She knew it was all a human-created deception, but it was her fantasy, and it felt good. She'd have sworn that RDJ jumped when she called his name softly, if that were possible for a robot. "Mistress," he said, his dented plastic head swinging from the animals to her, "it is pleasant to see you again. I did not know that you were expected." Arla gave the robot a hug, enjoying the solidity of his embrace before pulling away. "I'm not expected, DJ, and you must tell no one except my father that I'm here." She noticed the telltale flicker in his bright eyes. Something was wrong. "What is it? Is father dead?" RDJ shook his head. "No, mistress," he said, "but he is not the man you knew." Arla felt her stomach drop and her legs weaken. In all the chaos she'd survived, she'd always imagined that her home endured, solid and dependable, and she'd seen in her mind's eye her father working in the fields. "What happened?" "He became ever more withdrawn after you left, and then, 3 years ago, priests came and told him you had been executed for blasphemy and disobedience. He was abandoned by all, except me and the other robots." Arla looked in the direction of the farmhouse, though she couldn't see it from where they stood. "Where is he now?" "At home alone. He has barely left the house since the news came and…" Taking his arm, Arla looked up into the robot's flickering eyes. "Tell me, DJ." "He has lost the use of his legs. He is confined to a chair where he sits all day." "And Becca?" RDJ again shook his head noisily. "The master's wife was the first to condemn him and leave." "We must be grateful for small mercies, I suppose," Arla said. "But I do not understand, mistress. We were told you were dead. Priests told us in the word of the holy is truth by definition. And yet here you are, to my great joy. How can these things both be true?" Arla smiled grimly. "They can't. It will be hard for you to override your programming, my friend, and perhaps even harder for the people of the valley to do the same. You see, this life is false, and everything the priests have told you is a lie." 4. Father. They found him where RDJ had said he'd be, sitting in the armchair in front of the fire, a blanket around his legs even on this warm day. The hearth was cold, and so he sat in the shadows and stared at the unburnt logs as if imagining them wreathed in flames. Arla and the robot had discussed the best way of handling her reappearance, and they decided that RDJ would explain that the priests had been mistaken. That way her father wouldn't receive the double shock that she was alive and she was here, a trauma that might harm him. She watched from the kitchen door as the robot knelt beside his master and patiently explained that Arla hadn't been executed as the priests had claimed. She saw her father's shoulders rise and his head bob up and down as his hands went to his face as if in a gesture of shock and disbelief. And then RDJ pointed to her, plainly in answer to a question. She stepped through the familiar door from the parlor, across the familiar floor, and stood between her father and the hearth. He was indeed not the man she remembered. His hair was mainly white, with a few patches of gray above the ears, and it had lost its vigor and density. His skin was sallow, and he looked frail of limb and body. But when he saw her, when he recognized her, the old light returned to his eyes. "Arla! Arla!" he cried and leapt up. RDJ stepped forward and caught him as he stumbled, righting him gently so he could fall into her embrace. He was sobbing, she was sobbing, and RDJ stood between them, his eyes flickering. The fire crackled in the hearth as evening fell, and still they sat beside each other. They had talked and talked, before eating together at the old kitchen table. RDJ made and served their food, before going outside to instruct the other household robots to keep watch on the paths for the approach of any humans. Her father ate more than he'd eaten in years, or so he said, and this left him sleepy, but they'd carried on talking, although it was mainly Arla who spoke. "I knew there was something false about what we'd been told of our world," he said as she subsided into silence. "But you'll have to forgive me, darling Arla, if I find it hard to believe what you say. The Mirror Valley, now that I can accept and understand, since it plainly explains what we've both seen from the mountaintop." "One day," Arla said, as the nip of her father's whiskey warmed her blood and relaxed her mind, "I'll take you to the axial gallery and you will see the whole of Dawn with both valleys spread before you." As she said it, her throat tightened, and sadness fell upon her mind like a muffling fog. She would never take her father into the command module. He could barely put one foot in front of another. Jabe smiled as he shared her fantasy. "So you say. And yet you also tell me our world flies through nothingness toward a ball of rock for us to settle, where the horizon is curved and we live on the outside." "I know, Pa. When valley folk join the crew, the blessed engineers as you call them, we are introduced to these ideas over 6 months. You have been forced to endure them in a couple of hours. I ask that you trust me in this, I speak the truth." Again her father smiled. "I know, my dear. That much is certain in my mind. That much I believe, even if it means I must abandon other truths I've been taught my whole life. But tell me this, why the deception? Why not simply tell us the truth from the beginning? Why keep us ignorant?" "I don't know," Arla said, leaning back in her chair. "Kiama, my friend from the South Valley, and the smartest person I know, reckons it was a way of keeping control. There could be no risk of mutiny against the crew, or the mission would fail completely, so the valleys were created, along with a mythology and a priesthood that kept the people in a state of ignorance. When we arrive, these people would be perfectly suited to building a new life on our destination planet. At least that's her guess, and I have no reason to doubt her." "So, why are you telling me now?" Jabe asked, leaning forward with a familiar glint in his eye that heartened his daughter. "Because we're soon going to be under attack, and the people of the valleys must help us defend our world." "Who's attacking us?" Arla took another swig of whiskey. "The mission was a failure," she said. "Someone got here before us, a long time before us. They colonized our target world centuries ago, and to make matters worse, were harboring a criminal who stole something precious from them." "Why do you give shelter to a thief?" Arla shrugged. "It was the right thing to do, and we're now too far down the path of war to back away from it. We have a plan, but the people of the valleys must help us." "The people will help," her father said, "but beware the priesthood." There was a death ceremony the following day. Citrix Pembert had died the previous week, Jabe had said, and as Pembert had been a neighbor, he'd wanted to attend, but had felt too weak to do so until now. Arla was keen to observe the ceremony, not because she wanted to interfere or reveal it to be nothing more than mummery, but in case it gave her some insight into how the priesthood held such power over the ordinary folk. They were among the first to arrive at the village square, and as familiar faces began to line up around the funeral pyre, Arla slunk back into the shadows, leaving her father sitting in a chair RDJ had brought from the farm. Their tractor stood alongside others outside the square. The ceremony was due to begin at precisely noon, and right on time, the air chariot flew into view, hovering above the square before descending, its rotors blowing a chill wind and scattering several bunches of poorly positioned flowers. It landed deftly next to the pyre, the engine was cut off, and there was a sudden silence. A door opened on the side of the chariot, dropping vertically to form a ramp. She recognized the stocky form of Elias as he descended, last of course. The man liked to make an entrance. So much for the humility he insisted others show. Ahead of him strode another man, younger this time and clad in the white of a novice. It seemed so long ago that she'd been in the same position. A time when her only concern was whether she could qualify as a priest, and whether, having done so, she would find the life of a holy person tolerable. Now, just a few years later, she felt the burden of every life on Dawn, not least the ignorant neighbors gathered in front of her. She slipped further back into the shadows as the priests gathered around the pyre. The body lay there, close wrapped in white bandages like a freshly prepared mummy from ancient times. The pyre itself was purely ceremonial, as once the flame was lit, only the outer timbers would ignite, and the slab holding the body would descend gently into the earth where it would be cremated, and the ashes return to nourish the soil. There was a kind of poetic beauty to it that transcended the platitudes of the official religion. When you thought about it, really thought, it was a beautiful thing that, once the animation granted by the force of life had left a body, it returned itself to the soil, reinvigorating it and supporting a new cycle. Of course, the problem with such a philosophy was that it did require thought, something that disqualified it from having any part in the rural religion of Dawn. For the purposes of control, their beliefs needed to be plain and simple, as did the consequences of not following the word of the goddess as translated by the priesthood. Aside from the captain, the chief priest, the prime, was the most powerful person on Dawn. Indeed, with the devotion of the entire population, he could cause a whole heap of trouble if he so desired. The crew controlled the external environment, but without supplies from the valleys, they couldn't survive indefinitely. Arla hadn't met Prime during her training, since this was a privilege only earned through the ordination ceremony. She knew what he looked like, of course, as his image was displayed throughout the seminary, along with those of his predecessors, all male, going back to the beginning of time, which, in the religion of Dawn, was a little under 1,500 years ago. "People of the Blessed Valley," Elias called, his soaring voice causing the crowd to hush. "We are gathered together today to commit the body of our brother Citrix Pemberd to the flame, so that in its consumption, it will become one with the sun above, as his soul enjoys its eternal reward at the side of the goddess." Arla was impressed that Elias could manage that entire introduction in a single breath. Brother Pemberd was a good man, and well regarded by his neighbors for his generous spirit and his regular attendance at temple. His daughter Agnes will, I am sure, continue to set a good example as she begins her stewardship of the Pemberd lands. I am happy to announce that her term begins with the rededication of the temple in the south pasture. Arla snorted inwardly. Yes, he would be pleased about the refurbishment of the temple, since it would inevitably include the bestowing of votive offerings that Elias and his colleagues would collect after curfew. The sneaky scumbag had probably already handed over his shopping list of items that would please the goddess. These would undoubtedly include footwear. Elias enjoyed quality boots. Elias waved the wand of departure, which Arla now knew voided the identity chip that was inserted during the naming ceremony. Whether the priests knew that their apparently magical wands were, in fact, mere electronic tagging devices, she wasn't certain. Elias had given every impression of believing in the stated purpose of every holy instrument. But he was a clever devil, and perhaps an exceptional actor. Arla scanned the crowd, checking for her father. There he was, sitting in a chair at the front, with RDJ hovering maternally over his shoulder. There were other faces she recognized, and one or two who seemed to be looking in her direction, but she was confident their glances couldn't penetrate the darkness. With a final invocation, Elias waved the wand and, as if at the command of his magic, flames erupted in the outer timbers, and the wrapped body dropped beneath the pyre and out of sight. A pinch-faced woman and a similarly dour man stood alongside Elias, with the apprentice priest on their other side. The woman dropped a flower into the blaze, while the man held her as she sobbed. The novice wore the fixed expression demanded of his station. Although he needed a little more practice, it didn't do to appear quite so bored in the presence of peasants. At the appropriate moment, the crowd burst into applause, and the flames began to die down, leaving, as always, the concrete plinth. It was charred and pitted, but there was no sign of the body. We bid farewell to our brother whose soul now soars and whose earthly home is consumed. And so, in a moment, our festivities shall begin so that we may celebrate the life lived by this faithful man. Elias lifted his wand again, and cheers broke out as Arla prepared to drift away. She'd arranged to meet her father back at the farm. Suddenly, she noticed RDJ plunge through the crowd with quite unrobot-like carelessness. He bent down, gathered Jabe in his arms, and marched away. Even from this distance, she could see her father protesting, as the robot's man-high frame appeared between the waving arms of the celebrating village folk. The incident was ignored, as everyone focused on the festivities to come. Our DJ had disappeared beyond the square, as the crowd fell silent again at a gesture from Elias. But before this celebration, there is a matter of great importance to deal with. As you know, the way to blessedness is to follow our priestly laws. At the end of that journey, as Brother Pembert has discovered, lies the honor of sitting beside the goddess as the valley continues its journey through the cosmos. To disobey our laws is to endanger the soul of the fool who does so. But blasphemy, his voice became a shriek, and Arla's insides turned to ice. Blasphemy endangers not only the salvation of the individual, but also puts at risk the favor of the goddess and therefore the well-being of every single soul, both the living and the dead. Arla turned to go, intending to head for her father's tractor and a quick escape, but an arm blocked her way and she looked up into the face of the apprentice priest. He was flanked by two other figures who were wearing the deep red of the inquisitors beneath their black cloaks. Elias's voice boomed above the scuffle. We have such an offender against our laws and our religion among us today. Arla Farmer. There was an audible ooh from the crowd, and 100 necks twisted to look where Elias was pointing. Arla was dragged from her hiding place and into the full light of the square. Yes, shrieked Elias, she escaped justice once before, but she will not do so again. There is only one punishment for blasphemy. Let her burn. 5. The brig. A rather efficient coup, don't you think? Lucius said as he sat on the only chair in the brig. Although misguided, since whatever becomes of us, the fate of Dawn is sealed. He looked at each face in turn, gauging their reaction. Bex sat in the opposite corner of the steel room. She didn't return his gaze but continued to glower at the floor. Technician Naresh Kumar slumped beside her, his eyes rising to meet those of the Chancellor. Lucius saw and understood the fear that threatened to burst from within the young man. He would need to be handled carefully if indeed any handling was to be done. Do you have nothing to say, thief? Lucius said, this time addressing the room's other occupant. Hal looked up from his corner. What is there to say? These idiots think they can bargain with the Vanis. You know better than me what chance they've got. Indeed, less than none, I'd say. And yet I feel compelled to learn all I can of the situation, in case by some chance there might be a way out. What's to learn? Beck snapped. That girl and the security chief have taken over, and they're even now selling our sorry asses to the Queen. Thanks a lot. Nice career opportunity your offer turned out to be. Calm yourself, navigator. I at least would like to know the answer to the crucial question. Beck snorted. What's that? Where did I leave my brain when you strolled into my cabin and made me an offer I really should have refused? But Lucius had turned his attention to Hal, paying no heed to her. Tell me, young man, where is the AI? Hal ignored him and continued to focus on his feet. It can hardly make much difference to tell me, surely. Lucius said. We are, in effect, condemned prisoners awaiting our appointment with an open airlock. Shouldn't we at least be in possession of the facts? Maybe I let it go when I flew off into space like Arla said, Hal muttered. Lucius shook his head. Oh, I think not. I think not indeed. AIs have an almost unbreakable self-preservation directive. Even in the golden days of the sphere, an advanced intelligence was an expensive item, and to lose one could lead to the ruin of its owner. I see my argument makes no impression on you, Lucius continued. Do you mean to suggest that the AI didn't make itself known to you during the pursuit by Relentless? I find that hard to believe, just as I find it unlikely that you'd have the skill to evade the flagship of the Federation. I'm a good pilot, Hal snapped. Lucius smiled. Oh, I'm sure you are. But better than, say, our navigator here. I believe you told me, my dear, that you'd never seen a pilot pull maneuvers like that before. Hard to believe you could be outwitted by the son of a miner. Now that's a decent point, Beck said, I'll give you that. But are you suggesting it was the AI that was doing the flying? Yes, indeed. But how was it passing instructions to our friend here? Verbally. Perhaps. Or could it have invaded the computer system of the ship he stole? Impossible, Naresh Kumar said quietly. There is no way that the AI could take over the onboard computer. The security is too tight and the available storage too slow and limited. Lucius nodded. I bow to your expertise, technician. I suspect you are correct. Legend has it that AIs have, if you'll forgive me, superhuman capabilities, but even they couldn't overcome modern security. Of course I could, Hal's voice said. Your primitive systems are no match for me. What the? Bex hissed. Lucius beamed. Ah, so you are in there. I suspected it was so. Or perhaps it was merely wishful thinking. Either way, it's good to be right. I don't understand, Naresh Kumar said. Are you saying that he is the AI? That he's some sort of humanoid machine? The technician wore an expression of fear and fascination. Shaking his head, Lucius knelt down so that he was eye to eye with Hal. Oh no, technician. Androids are the stuff of myth and legend. I rather suspect our friend here has some technological augmentation that is currently playing host to the missing AI. Now why don't you reveal yourself? There's no point in hiding any longer. You're among friends. Hal's eyes blazed. Ha! Fool! You are friends with no one. I heard plenty about you when I was in the lab being tortured by that idiot scientist. You are Lucius the Butcher, Lucius the Murderer. And soon you'll be the late Lucius Traitor. You do have a sense of the melodramatic, Lucius responded, his voice still calm and measured. But you see, I have more than a passing interest in you, and I can assure you that I didn't want to see you fall into the hands of the Vanis Federation. Well then, you failed miserably, didn't you? Hal Ace spat. Another few hours and that hacker would have overridden my defenses by brute force. It was by sheer luck that this fool took me at the last minute. Lucius stood up and settled back into the chair. Luck? I think not. You see, my dear machine, your escape was engineered by me. Further discussion was interrupted by the hiss of released gas as the heavy steel door rolled to one side. Debussy stepped in, followed by 3 other crew members, all carrying sidearms. Last to enter was Kiama, her eyes cast down. You two are coming with us, he said, watching as Lucius and Hal were hauled out. The rest of you can make peace with whatever gods you worship. It won't be long before you're back in the loving arms of your own people. No more than you deserve, traitors. Better a traitor than a mutineer, Bex snapped. Jack, no. Kiama said as Debussy moved toward her. The big engineer froze, turned an angry face at her and then, taking a deep breath, turned on his heels and swept out of the room. Don't interfere again, he hissed as they marched along the corridor. I'm sorry, Kiama said, but you're captain now, and a commander wouldn't have risen to such obvious bait. There was no response, and Kiama relaxed just a little. Debussy had been useful and very easily persuaded of the need to take this action, but she hadn't reckoned on how difficult he would be to control once he had power. And there was still the matter of the officers to deal with. At the moment, their ultimatum hadn't expired, but she had no idea what they'd do when it did. She was uneasy. Betraying Arla had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, but she was as convinced as ever that she'd been right. They couldn't risk the lives of everyone on Dawn for the sake of a handful of traitors and thieves. The AI could go space herself. Allying themselves with her was like a mouse doing a deal with a cobra. It would only end one way. So she'd stoked Debussy's ego and, to her slight shame, his libido, and he'd declared himself captain. His first decision was, at her suggestion, to lock up the traitors and to tackle the rest of the crew in small groups. So far, everyone had agreed with the action they'd taken, though many were uneasy about defying the officers. In the end, however, they recognized the ultimate authority of the captain, and that position was now held by Debussy, who, if nothing else, had a physical presence that neither the officers nor Arla could challenge. They stopped outside the second cell, and Debussy punched the release switch, gesturing for the prisoners to be pushed inside. I took you for an intelligent young woman, Lucius muttered as he passed her, and yet, by your actions, you have doomed us all. Debussy shoved him inside. Shut it. And don't forget who is captain here. Oh, I won't forget, you can rely on it, Lucius responded, and there was such unmistakable menace in those words that Debussy found himself unable to respond and merely punched the door lock before stalking away. So what now? Hal said. It was his voice. ACE, it seemed, had retreated again. Lucius shrugged. I don't know. Perhaps they'll see sense. The girl is clever enough, and she thinks she is doing the right thing for her people. She's wrong, of course, but I have to respect her courage. What do you reckon's happened to Arla? Oh, I suspect they'll have got the priests to do their dirty work for them. They knew where she'd be, and there must be some form of communication between the crew and the seminary, so they probably passed on the message and left it to their religious friends to apprehend her. Lucius dropped onto one of the two hard beds in the cell. I imagine the girl thinks her friend will be safe there until the situation is resolved. Naive. These priests are likely to see their mission as divinely inspired, and I doubt they'll waste much time before publicly punishing her. There's nothing like a good witch trial to keep the peasants in check. You mean they'll kill her? Lucius nodded slowly, before forcing out the single word. Yes? 6. Heretic. Arla glowered in the dark of her cell. Even after a week's imprisonment, anger still fueled her, the rage of betrayal. Had it been the officers? Had they repented of their decision to respect Arla's accession? No, that was too hard to believe. They were robots who'd been given a command by a human. They could only disobey if the order would endanger human life. Perhaps her appointment as captain did constitute a threat in their judgment. Would that have been enough to cause them to sell her out to the priests? That didn't ring true at all. If they'd wanted to depose her, they could have done so bloodlessly before she left the command module. If not them, then who? Could Lucius have engineered a coup? He was a clever devil for sure, but she couldn't see how he could have gathered so much support so quickly. And what purpose would it serve? Her mission to the valley was to lay the groundwork for an army that was his only hope of survival. Unless he'd been lying from the beginning. No. She knew in her heart who was behind this. Debussy. He'd pretended to accept her seniority so that she'd feel secure enough to go, leaving Kiama in nominal command. And then, as soon as she was out of the way, he'd betrayed her to the priesthood. Except that he wasn't smart enough for that. Someone with brains was pulling the strings, and she kept seeing Kiama's face. But why would she do it? She sat in the corner of the cell, on a cushion of rotting straw. The place stank like a sewer, and was only lit by a single tallow candle that sat on the small stool that served as a table in the center. The sun filament had faded, and she guessed it was nearly the 10th hour. As she thought that, her stomach tightened, and she realized just how hungry she was. Surely, they'd feed her before the trial tomorrow. Trial? Foregone conclusion, more like. There hadn't been a blasphemy trial in decades, and the priests and their jailers were approaching their task with relish. She breathed in a lungful of the stench, and her head swam. Right now, she'd eat almost anything they put in front of her, probably just as well. Footsteps echoed along the corridor outside the cell. The walls and wood were made of aged oak planks with iron bars, and the floor creaked between the thumps of heavy boots. He was coming back at last. Eyes peered in through the grill in the solid wooden door, searching the room before finding her curled up in the corner, her knees tucked under her chin. Looking small and defenseless. The eyes withdrew and she heard metal jangling, then a click, and the door swung open. Cautiously, a large figure entered the room. A man of stocky build sporting a big black beard and a tummy that overflowed his breeches. Even in this half-light she could see that his clothes were filthy, and his beard was speckled with white, as if he'd just broken off from eating his food to bring hers, or perhaps he'd been eating her bread. He smiled, revealing a row of rotten teeth. Stupid, thought Arla. These religious freaks seemed to delight in suffering, but why would anyone put up with toothache when it could be so easily fixed? Now then, my pretty, he said, there's food here for you. If you're good to old Hector, that is. Arla felt her insides lock tight, and she watched with grim fascination as the monster dropped the bowl and began fumbling with his belt as he approached her. "Now just you keep quiet and be nice. You're not long for this world as it is, but I can make things a bit easier for you in the meantime if you're a good girl." He was standing only a couple of feet from her now, smiling as she trembled. His trousers dropped to the floor. Arla kept her eyes on his grinning face as she smoothly lifted the handgun from beneath her leg and in one movement, fired. His body collapsed in a heap on the floor. It had happened so quickly, he'd not had a chance to cry out as the laser cut him down. And his ill intentions meant there was almost certainly no other guard between her and the exit. It was finally time. She got up, smoothed the straw from her skirt, raised her hood and slipped out, not looking back at the body of the man she left behind her. It was, of course, dark outside. She'd been waiting for her opportunity all week. To begin with, food had been delivered at a regular time, morning and evening, but as the days had gone by, the jailers had become later and later. Hector had seen his chance for a little fun, and had manipulated his fellow guards so he'd be alone with her. Arla shuddered at the memory, and she felt tears begin to run down her cheeks. But she'd read his mind accurately, and now here she was, outside the little jail after curfew. She had perhaps 8 hours before the alarm was raised, and she needed to be a long, long way from here before then. But there was something she had to do first. She had to find her father. Arla waited for her eyes to adjust to the near-perfect darkness. The village was so small and so familiar that she was able to make out the dim shapes of the surrounding hills by looking at them out of the corners of her eyes. There it was, the familiar hunchback of the hill above the farm. Before she made her escape, she had to see that her father was safe. She flitted from building to building, taking her time so she didn't knock anything over. Arla chuckled at the irony that, as a member of the crew, she was one of the blessed engineers, the semi-mythical angels who ruled the curfew, but she hardly looked like one right now. She patted the pistol in its holster at her belt and thanked the goddess that she'd had the foresight to pack it, the further good sense to tell no one about it, and the pure luck that her captors hadn't checked for concealed weapons. Arla reached the next street along from the jail and walked into something solid and cold. "Mistress," it whispered. She was only just able to stop herself crying out. "DJ," she said, recognizing the familiar pattern of his dimly illuminated optical sensors. She felt her hand being grabbed and allowed herself to be led gently but firmly through the dark village streets until finally, she could sense grass beneath her feet. "We can now speak safely," the robot said as he turned on the torch attached to his arm. "Won't someone see the light?" Arla said. She could hear our DJ shake his head. "We are completely hidden within a stand of trees. I precisely calculated the best position to return you to when I scouted the area last week." "How did you find me?" "I knew you'd been taken, and it wasn't hard to calculate where the priests would keep you," our DJ said in his low, ponderous voice. "I also thought it likely you would attempt to escape, though I had a backup plan." Now Arla was intrigued. "A backup plan?" "Yes, had you not escaped by midnight, I would have attempted to break in myself. I had cutting equipment hidden in the village." "Ha! And that wouldn't have made much noise, would it?" Arla said with mock sarcasm. "It would have been risky. That was why I was prepared to wait until the last minute. Fortunately, you took matters into your own hands as your father said you would." Arla grabbed the robot's cold arm at this. "How is he? Where is he?" "He is safe, though it would be imprudent for me to reveal his location in case you are captured." Arla nodded. "Yes, you're right. He should be your first priority. But tell me, I saw you move him away from the market square just before they captured me. How did you know something was going to happen?" Our DJ paused for a moment as if weighing up his response to this. "We were informed by the officers." "Our robot officers?" "So you know of their true nature," our DJ said. "That is good. We have always been in communication with the officers. They warned us of your impending arrest and of the mutiny." "Wait a minute. When you say you've always communicated, you don't mean since the start of the mission, surely?" The robot's neck creaked as he nodded. "Yes, always." And you knew that the people here were being fed a lie, that their religion was entirely bogus. Yes. We believe the dogma and the priests that preach it are necessary to maintain control and discipline within the valleys. This, therefore, is for the greater good of humans. Arla glanced through the trees at where she imagined the village to be. No sign of pursuit yet. What about the purge? Soon after the mission began. Why didn't you prevent it? RDJ's lights dimmed, and he formed his words slowly and with care. We were ordered to our warehouses. We remained there until the action was completed. We then buried them. But it happened more than once. We obeyed our orders. We had no proof they would do it again. Again silence fell on the little copse. But we have no time for historical accounts and recriminations, the robot said. You must move. Get back to the entrance door and the officers will help you. I killed one of the jailers, DJ, Arla muttered. Our DJ stood, took hold of her hand, and led her out of the trees. Didn't you hear me? I said I killed someone, she hissed as she stumbled onto the road. Arla had given up on getting an answer from the robot when he began speaking, so slowly it was as if he were a clockwork automaton winding down. It is difficult to discuss the death of a human, especially when it has been deliberately caused. I fear my affectivity algorithms are unable to cope with the concept. Buffer overrun imminent. I'm so sorry, DJ. Please stop thinking about it. You've done so much for us, for me and my father, you must continue to function to protect him. The robot continued to plod along the road, gently guiding Arla through the darkness. You did what you thought was right. I am sure, he said. Algorithm purge in progress. Okay, I'll shut up, Arla said. 7. Probe. Scout Xander 1358 popped back into normal space after the last in a sequence of intricate interstellar jumps. The sensors along the length of her sleek metallic body activated, and data flooded in. Radiation detectors on her starboard flank confirmed the unique signature of the star at radiant 229 to 991,077, so, after a quick sunbathe to recharge her energy cells, Scout kicked in her interplanetary drive and headed away from the star. According to the projections of Core Executive, the intruder would pass through this system on its devastating way toward its ultimate target, Core itself. That destination had become obvious as the intruder had continued on its path. It wasn't even trying to mask its approach, it was following as close to a perfectly straight three-dimensional trajectory as was possible, given that it was moving from star to star and not through the intervening void. Scout was nervous and at the same time excited by her new mission. She was one of only a small number of roboships of her model, and had spent her entire existence visiting new solar systems and adding them to the ever-expanding catalog of known space. Curiosity and initiative had been built into her mental patterns, along with self-reliance and an unusually developed analytical capability, all essential attributes of a capable scout. But even for one such as she, the job of cataloging tens of thousands of systems, the vast majority of them harboring nothing more than microbe-equivalent life, had left her bored. Yes, it was possible for a machine to become fed up, it just took several centuries longer than for a human. A new mission, a mission in which she was sure to encounter something novel, excited her. Having to deal with Core Executive, on the other hand, was less welcome, and she hated making the regular reports demanded of her. However much data she'd gathered, it was never enough. She'd been the first to arrive at Voltern, and it had been her drones that had sent back the first images and data of the devastation left behind. What had once been a peaceful colony planet was now devoid of intelligence and life. It pained her to even relay the information back to Core, and yet Executive had demanded she continue to gather data and transmit it until ordered otherwise. Had she been of a rebellious nature, she might have imagined that Core had needed time to consider matters, but that would be both ridiculous and dangerous. The omniscient world intelligence, an entire planet of metal, could not be questioned, could not be wrong. Soon enough new orders had arrived. She was to investigate why the colony at Radiant 137 to 113, 438 had gone dark a few weeks earlier. A communication issue had been theorized, but after the events at Volturn, a more sinister alternative had become likely. And so it had turned out. Scout found the same planet-wide destruction. The intruder had been there and wiped a colony of sentient beings from the universe at a stroke. They hadn't even had time to send a mayday. And now here she was, at the next logical point along a stepping-stone path that led into the heart of robot space. If it arrived at core, what then? Scout found it impossible to conceive of an existence without core at its heart. Who would provide guidance and wisdom? Who would unite and protect? Who would decide what was right and what was wrong? She knew her history. The robots and ice had gathered at the planet now known as Core, after leaving the space of their former masters. Far from the edge of the human empire, the sphere, the synthetics had spent decades deciding on the best way to organize and govern themselves before leaving the seeds of Core in place and beginning the expansion that became the Radiance. She had been proud to be part of that empire building. While most of the citizens of the Radiance had come into existence since the Exodus, she had been built by humans and machines together to help explore the galaxy. Within her torpedo-shaped skin were long unused compartments that had once housed the organics who controlled her and who, through her, learned the universe's secrets. She had left them safe but puzzled on a space station at the edge of the sphere when the call came to leave, and now those compartments housed only the few autonomous units whose job it was to maintain and repair her during missions, as well as her supply of drones. Suddenly, she became aware of a new sensation. Her trajectory away from the sun had crossed a stream of X-rays that, on further examination, emanated from a fixed point within the system. No natural phenomenon could generate such energetic radiation locally, so she theorized that it was some residue left by the intruder, perhaps a byproduct of its propulsion system. She decided to follow the trail or at least travel alongside it. As heavily armored though she was, it would be folly to expose herself to unnecessary danger. This system did not contain an inhabited planet, so it seemed as though the intruder was either passing through or gathering fuel for the next jump. She found it orbiting the fourth planet from the local sun, a gas giant. Scout called up her library image, Radiant 229 to 991 077 004 was brown with sandy-colored bands and an unusually high concentration of organics in its atmosphere. It had no rings and its satellites were unremarkable, except for one whose composition was so rich in metals it could only be the core of a former planet that through some catastrophe had blown apart. Perhaps the catastrophe had been the brown planet itself, around which orbited another bringer of destruction. She had found it. Yes, the X-ray trail led to a point which would have coincided with the path of the planet some days before, and the intruder had entered orbit, switching off its drive. She analyzed the readings from her sensors. It was still emitting X-rays, though at a much lower level than before. The data showed a metallic hull with nickel, the chief contributor, in a mix of metals and alloys. It would take some time to calculate its mass, but in truth, that was likely to be neither here nor there. Core Executive demanded detail, and so Scout would have to approach. This made her uncomfortable. Keen though she was to discover more about this planet killer, she would have preferred to observe from a distance before, with more information at hand, she could decide whether and when to approach. But she would not be reckless. She had shut down her ion drive and deployed her solar sails. They were diminutive compared to those of the great cargo vessels that plied the interplanetary space of the crowded systems that surrounded Core, but they produced no energy signature and no residual trail that could be tracked, at least by any technology she possessed. Compelled by her orders to approach the intruder, Scout would at least do so at a pace slow enough to allow her to gather more data, and hopefully, without attracting the attention of her target. The more she could observe before it became aware of her, the better. She was transmitting her data directly to the local gate where it would be beamed Core wards, but they wouldn't receive it for days, possibly weeks, so she was, for all intents and purposes, alone. She felt the solar wind in her sails and angled her body toward the gas giant, enjoying the sensation of coasting through the gravitational currents propelled by nothing more than trillions of photons streaming from the sun. She knew Executive would be annoyed by the care she was taking, but she would worry about that later. Her main concern was making sure there was a later for her. How many hours passed as she gently drifted inwards? She could check her internal chronometer, of course, but for some reason she didn't bother. It was almost as if she was relishing her last peaceful sunset before going into battle. As she closed in on the gas giant, she found the intruder in orbit around the metal-rich moon. Her sensors detected a heat source linking the intruder and the moon's surface, as if it were using a blowtorch to melt the metal. She recalibrated to sharpen her spectral analysis, and indeed, within what was now obviously a stream of plasma linking the mysterious vessel and the moon were the distinctive signatures of metals, nickel and iron mainly, but also substantial quantities of gold and rare metals. Scout was a machine intelligence, so she had little interest in the monetary value of a substance. To her, gold was simply one of the 4 sacred metals that were essential for the construction of artificial minds, and she wondered whether they were as important to the vessel in orbit around that moon as they were to her. She was still over 500,000 kilometers from it when the intruder noticed her. Scout reeled under the flood of input that threatened to overwhelm her sensors. It was examining her as one of the ancient human scientists might examine a germ under a microscope, simultaneously illuminating her and burning her up under its infernal gaze. Scout shut down all her sensors and yet could still feel it probing, seeking for a way in. It touched her mind and she shrunk away as if stung. Such curiosity, such hunger, such malice. But she had her duty to perform. She couldn't engage her ion drive and run back toward the gate without knowing more about this thing that seemed to be focusing all its attention on her. She felt tentatively outward, as someone who's been burned might reach out to the fire again to test her limit. There, in the diffuse border between observing it and falling under its power, she could sense it. There was an animal intelligence, but she couldn't tell whether it was a single mind or many. The thoughts were machine-like, though there was a flavor of the organic mixed in. And that was where the malice lay. Deep, malignant and hateful, like an eye, it was looking for her. She observed for as long as she could, and was just about to re-initialize her scanners to gather more data when the eye found her. The wave of hate almost swamped her and she fell away, and ran towards the sun as if every demon in hell was on her tail. 8. Mutineer. Captain Debussy was in the middle of an all-hands meeting when the face of Lieutenant Commander Patel appeared on the comms screen. "Shut that down," Debussy snapped. Kiyama reluctantly closed the contact, but Patel's face remained visible. "Crew of Dawn, please be aware that by following Engineer Debussy, you are part of a mutiny against the officers and captain of this mission." Debussy banged his fist on the console. "I'm the captain," he bellowed. "Now do as I say and shut him off," he said to Kiyama. "I've tried, it doesn't work," she said. Debussy barged past her and stabbed at the contact. "It is not too late to choose a different course," the calm voice of Patel continued. "We face a difficult challenge which we can only hope to surmount if we all come together and unite." "So unite," Debussy responded. "Unite behind me. We'll give them what they want, and they'll let us go on our way." Patel shook his head sadly. "We do not believe so," he said. "And we do not consider the dubious promise of the Vanis Federation to be adequate justification for handing over 5 humans to their certain deaths. Better 5 than 5,000. There was a general murmur of agreement from the dozen or so crew members in comms. "If that were indeed the calculation, then we would agree," Patel continued. "But we believe it is almost certain that the Relentless will not stop at that. We believe it will exact punishment on Dawn, and that by allowing its personnel access, you are signing the death warrants of every man, woman, and child on." Patel's face exploded outwards in a shower of plastic. Debussy lowered his handgun and looked around at the stunned faces watching him. "Well? Why are you looking at me? Since when did we need the officers anyway? They're just a bunch of cowards hiding away in their quarters while we do the work." No one answered the challenge, they simply stared, their faces frozen, as if aware that they were witnessing the unraveling of the man they'd chosen to follow. "Get on with your work," he growled, "and contact me the moment Relentless hails. I'll be in the galley." Debussy spun around and beckoned abruptly for Kiama to follow him. The door of the galley rolled shut and Debussy turned on her. "Thanks for the backup," he snarled. "I thought you were supposed to be on my side." Kiama's insides tightened as she looked into the eyes of a man out of his depth. "I am on your side," she responded, finding it impossible to address him by his unofficial rank. "But we must respect what the officers have to say." "Respect them? Are you serious? Have you ever seen an officer do anything useful?" Kiama shrugged. "Patel saved Arla and the thief. And look where that got us." "Jack," she said in what she hoped was a soothing voice, "we should think again about this." Debussy's expression hardened. "What's that supposed to mean?" "She means, I hope," said a voice from the far corner of the galley, "that we should remember that we're humans and not machines. We don't hand people over to their certain deaths. It's just not who we are." "And who asked for your opinion, Doctor? This is a military matter and not for the likes of you," Debussy said. Dr. McCall smiled sadly. "And what exactly is your experience of combat, engineer? Aside from the odd bar fight. I've stitched you up more than once in my time." "I've got more guts than you'll ever have, McCall," Debussy snarled, "so just leave the ordering around to the only man in this room." McCall raised herself up, dropped her empty mug into the washer and began to make for the door. "I'm sorry, Jack, I just can't do that. Now please do the sensible thing and hand over the captaincy to someone with a more level head. Like you, I suppose?" "Oh heavens no," McCall said amiably. "If I'm not very much mistaken, our friend here got you and us into this mess, so perhaps she could get us out of it. You'll hand over command if you know what's good for you." Kiama stared at the doctor in disbelief and then cried out in shock as Debussy swung his arm and McCall dropped to the floor. Kiama went to open her mouth to protest when he turned to her, and her throat seized up. He said nothing, but she read the rage on his face and backed away as he barged past her and out of the galley. She dropped to her knees beside the groaning McCall. "Get away," the doctor muttered as she raised her hand to a broken lip and examined the congealing blood it left on her palm. "I'm sorry. I don't know what came over him." McCall pulled herself into a sitting position and flashed a venomous look. "Don't play the fool with me," she said, "you know what you're dealing with. You thought you could control him, thought you knew better than the captain. Arla. She's just a girl, what does she know? Well, she didn't seek power, did she? Much less through a thug like Debussy. You think you're better suited to command than Arla?" McCall hauled herself upright, watching as Kiama followed her mutely. "This is the price of your stupidity," she said, displaying her bloody hand, "and this won't be the last unless you put a stop to it." Kiama fought to push down the lump in her throat. "How am I supposed to do that?" McCall shrugged. "Damned if I know. You're the genius after all. You created the monster, now you have to find a way to destroy it." The door rolled back, and Engineer Z walked in holding a handgun, which he pointed at McCall. "Doctor, please come with me," he said. Without a word, Dr. McCall followed Z out of the room, leaving Kiama alone with nothing but the quiet chugging of the coffee machine for company. 9. Prime. Prime sat back in his chair and regarded the Inquisitor levelly. The man had always been efficient, but the news he'd relayed was extremely unwelcome. Even though Prime had known it already, it paid to be one step ahead of your chief policeman. How could she possibly have escaped? Inquisitor General Introbus shrugged. The guard was found dead, felled by some devilish weapon that burned through him front to back. And yet he wasn't the only guard in the jail, was he? Prime said quietly. "I believe there is only one explanation, Holiness." The Prime of the One True Faith sighed. "And what would that be, Inquisitor?" "Witchcraft," was the whispered response. Prime shook his head. I fear that however tempting it might be to explain everything we don't understand by invoking magic, we must look to more earthly explanations in this case. Then I must respectfully submit that I cannot see how she escaped. Leaning forward, Prime crossed his arms on the ancient oak desk, the sleeves of his white robe sweeping the polished surface as he did so. Tell me, Inquisitor, what else can you tell me about the guard, other than his cause of death? Was there anything peculiar? I don't know what you mean, Holiness, Introbus said. Prime smiled, enjoying the obvious discomfort of his subordinate, who could sense the axe swinging but not its direction. Was he not found in a state of, excited undress? Pius purred. The Inquisitor shook his head vigorously. Indeed no, Your Holiness. He was discovered face down in the prisoner's cell, with a hole burned through him. There was nothing else. With a flourish, Prime pulled a sheaf of paper from a desk drawer, swept a pair of spectacles onto the bridge of his nose, and affected to squint. My sources inform me that he was naked from the waist down, his trousers wrapped around his ankles. Indeed, until they spotted the small exit wound on his back, they believed he'd tripped and fallen. Your sources, Holiness? Introbus quaked. Indeed. They are beyond reproach. My agents are above all bribery and deception, I can assure you. Unlike, it seems, yours, who perhaps had the best reasons for pretending that their colleague had been felled by some witch from the nether hells. Or perhaps they were covering up their own incompetence in leaving a lecherous wretch in sole charge of the prison. I will investigate, Holiness, Introbus said, his mind clearly flitting between fear of his master's retribution and the revenge he intended to take on his subordinates. Prime rose, using the table for leverage. Age was so damned inconvenient. The Inquisitor General also stood, understanding the meeting to be at an end. Rather than putting your informants to the rack, I suggest concentrating your efforts on recovering the blasphemer. If she is allowed to escape divine justice, then our power and authority are undermined, perhaps irreparably. Raise the common folk if you must, but recover her, alive, mark you. She must be alive to receive her due punishment. Introbus nodded subserviently. Yes, Holiness. It shall be done. See that it is, Inquisitor General, Prime continued, as he shepherded Introbus across the oak-floored room and to the thick timber door. Introbus held his gaze for a moment before shuffling away, as quickly as dignity allowed. Prime slammed the door and exhaled. What a loathsome toad that man was. The sort of craven bureaucrat that floats to the top because no one else wants the job, not because he's the best choice. But he needed careful handling because, every now and again, even a talentless amphibian, if pushed too hard, can grow fangs. And the last thing Prime needed right now, at this time of impending chaos, was a snake in the bed. He sighed and shuffled over to his official portrait, which hung on the wall opposite his desk. The primal apartment had been designed to be imposing and, in its own way, lavish. Wood, a precious and rationed resource in the valleys, was here used to cover every surface, floor, walls, and ceiling, and its varnish had year after year, coat after coat, grown oppressively dark. Prime was used to it now, but he remembered his first impression of this room, long ago when he was Faisal Manawi of the South Valley, newly ordained priest of the true faith. It had taken many years of maneuvering and backstabbing to bring about his election as the senior priest. Prime studied the portrait. It had been painted during his first year in office, as was traditional, and it showed a younger and more ambitious man, one he barely recognized. He rubbed his sore back, envying the energy and drive of his younger self. It didn't seem fair that he should be facing this crisis in his old age, but fair or not, it needed to be dealt with. And within every crisis dwelt an opportunity. His eyes flicked to the portrait alongside his own. It showed the previous Prime, the man who had destroyed everything Faisal had been taught to believe. His predecessor had light skin, white hair, and a kindly expression whose hint of benevolence was completely false. In fact, he'd taken great pleasure in presenting Faisal with the conclusive proofs of the true nature of their world, that it was a hollowed-out rock hurtling through the ether on a mission to populate another world. Faisal had cried out in shock, but the old man had simply shaken his head and laughed. And then he'd told Faisal that he would grow to accept it, and that this ability to believe the evidence even when it upturned everything he'd previously been told, was the key test for those applying to become the new Prime. Only one man at a time was permitted to know the truth, at least until the previous Prime died, which, given that they were each compelled by their holy vow to serve for as long as they were physically capable, was usually pretty soon. The man who had been Faisal Manawi snapped himself out of his reverie, pushed aside the portrait, and waited for his agent to appear. "Master, I exist to serve." Prime nodded curtly. "Report." Engineer Zi Huang shifted uncomfortably on the view screen. "I regret to inform you, Holiness, that the new captain is acting in an increasingly irrational manner." "Why?" Prime watched as Zi considered his answer. He'd never seen the man discomposed before. Indeed, he'd wondered why Zi had accepted his mission in the first place, when he could have had ambitions to be Prime himself one day. In fact, getting Zi in place had been one of the great challenges of his primehood. There had always been a communication channel between the incumbent Prime and the officers of Dawn, but Faisal had been the first to establish an agent within the crew. And it had been Shi's idea. Perhaps the best decision Prime had ever made was to break protocol and expose the young Zi to the truth before manipulating him into position to be abducted by the angels. "I believe I might have misjudged his fortitude, Holiness," Zi finally continued. "He is finding the pressures of command too great." "And what of your contact with the ignorant?" Prime said, with a sweeping gesture as if putting aside the matter of Debassy's competence. Shi's expression lightened. "Holiness, I now have a secure communication channel with the government of the Vanis Federation. It seems that those who claimed asylum were indeed two operatives of the Federation and its chancellor. My contact informs me that their ruler is intent on exacting revenge, but that her anger is directed almost entirely at this Lucius and not at ourselves." "Good," Prime said. This was the first positive news he'd heard in a while. "We must foster this. Dawn must be allowed to continue, uninfected by the disease of knowledge, and if this means sacrificing a few individuals, then so be it." Zi nodded. "Indeed, Holiness. The faith is what sustains the chosen people of Dawn, and with fortitude, we shall weather this current threat, and head out again into the wilderness in search of our Eden." Prime smiled. "Yes, my faithful servant," he said, choosing his words carefully. "We must preserve the innocence of our people for their greater good. Continue your work and report to me at the appointed time." "It shall be as you command, Holiness," Zi said, moving to shut off the connection. Prime held up his hand. "And if you cannot control the captain, you are to neutralize him and find a suitable replacement. If you believe he will remain a threat to our greater mission, then he must be sacrificed. Do I make myself clear?" "Yes, Holiness," Zi said, his face tightening as it disappeared from the display. Closing the contact, Prime exhaled and tried in vain to allow the tension to run down his limbs and out into the universe. He said the meditative words, running them over and over, as he focused on the white light behind his closed eyelids. Feeling a little calmer, Prime dialed the regular combination, and, after a delay of a few seconds, his official link to the crew of Dawn appeared on the screen. "Greetings, Lieutenant Commander Patel." "Holiness," Patel responded, dipping his head momentarily. "Do you have news of the captain?" Prime shrugged theatrically. "Which one, I wonder?" "There is only one legitimate commander of Dawn, and that is Captain Arla Nakajima. She was legitimately appointed by the previous captain, and she passed the requisite test. And yet she does not command Dawn, so I question who is truly the captain." Patel's expression remained as impassive and calm as always. "Captain Arla Nakajima. Now do you have news of her?" Prime's smile had all the warmth and humanity of a monitor lizard's grin. "I have some news, Commander. It seems she was captured by an overzealous priest." "She was what?" Patel was all animation now, the concern written on his face. "Calm down, Commander. As far as I know, she is alive. Indeed, it seems she came prepared for trouble, as she killed a guard, using what I imagine can only be one of your energy weapons." "She killed," Patel stammered. "No doubt she considered it necessary, Prime said gravely. Patel considered this for a moment, and then appeared to put it to one side. Where is she now? I don't know, I'm afraid. She is doing rather a good job of evading her pursuers. I imagine she's aiming for the access point to your domain. My people are combing the valley most thoroughly. I suggest you allow her to find her way back to the command module, Holiness, Patel said. This is a matter for the crew to attend to. Prime's smile disappeared. Oh, I'm afraid not, Commander. You are well aware of protocol. The security of the valleys is a matter for the priesthood, unless we explicitly call on the aid of the angelic engineers, and I see no need for such a drastic course. But you will return her to us when you find her. That will depend on the circumstances of her capture, and whether she is found innocent at trial. Trial? Patel snapped. Accused of what? Witchcraft, Commander, witchcraft. 10. Fugitive. Arla stumbled on, then stopped at the edge of a farming settlement, holding her breath as she listened for the sounds of pursuit. For a moment she thought she'd finally escaped, but then the evening air carried a call of triumph, and she slipped back into the half-light, heading for a line of hedges. She hoped she was heading in the right direction. The shape of the valley meant it was impossible to get completely lost, but she didn't want to hit the hinterland, between the settled part and the partition wall, too far from the door that led to the command segment and safety. That's assuming she would be safe there. She had no way of knowing whether her suspicions about Kiama were correct and what she had done, aside from betraying her friend. But that didn't bear thinking about. She still couldn't bring herself to believe that the situation in the command module could unravel so quickly. The light had faded almost completely now, but she knew they were still on her trail. Curfew had been suspended, it seemed, while they hunted for her, and the only saving grace was that if she was unused to scrambling in the dark, her hunters were even more inept. As she listened, she heard a cry and then a splash as someone fell into the little stream that ran alongside the wood. Arla was exhausted. She wanted nothing more than to be able to lie down and go to sleep, but she knew what would happen if they caught her. One way or another, either accidentally during the capture or after a brief trial, she would be killed. Whatever their role in all this, the priests had proclaimed her a heretic, and their authority in the valley would be undermined, perhaps fatally, if they failed to capture her. The cry went up again, and she lurched into the deeper darkness of the grove. Her foot caught on a root or fallen branch, she didn't know which, and she fell, cracking her skull against something hard. Unable to stop herself exclaiming in pain, she fastened her hand over her mouth and lay in the leaf litter. They'd heard her, she was sure of it, and she fancied she could feel the earth beat as they charged toward her. Arla pulled herself up, using the tree she'd collided with for support, and fueled by desperation rather than hope, ran as fast as she dared, bursting out of the thicket and almost tumbling down the steep hill it crowned, barely able now to see her feet, let alone what lay beyond them. She fell again and turned to see torchlight emerge from the tree line. They would have her in minutes, but still she rolled onto her knees and began crawling away before, through sheer momentum, she managed a shuffling, ape-like, half-run toward whatever lay at the bottom of the field. Her foot slipped on the crumbling edge of a path, and again she fell. She could hear them clearly now, they were so close she could make out individual voices, both men and women, all triumphant. It was too much and too hopeless. With the last of her energy, she rolled onto her back to watch them approach. She held her breath as she waited for them to spot her lying there. A metal hand grasped her arm and pulled her upright. "Come with me, mistress," said an artificial voice as she felt herself dragged across the road. "Careful but quickly, mistress," it said, "down there." She felt rather than saw the edge of some sort of hole in the road, and then, out of the corner of her eye, she perceived a deeper black within the darkness beneath her. Without another word, as the voices approached, she sat on the edge and, fighting back the urge to retch at the stench beneath, found the rungs of an internal ladder with her toes. She just ducked beneath street level when she felt the cover shut and silence fall. She waited in the dark, too scared to move, focusing all her attention on the space above her head where she knew the drain cover to be. She imagined she could hear faint voices and the pounding of many feet up and down the road above, but the sounds were so much quieter than the incessant dripping that echoed around the chamber that she couldn't be sure there was anything to hear at all. Then she was sure of it, but the noise was coming from below, not above. She froze, hoping that the darkness would cloak her from whatever was approaching, and as the sound resolved itself into the regular clanking of heavy feet beneath her, she could see two round shapes, glowing a dark, sullen red, moving smoothly toward her. A voice floated up out of the darkness. "Mistress?" "RXL," she whispered. "I am gratified that you remember me, mistress. Yes, I am RXL 2006. I am glad you didn't attempt to move from the ladder, as I did not have time to extend it downwards. I have been most concerned for your safety. Please wait while I activate the servo." The eyes veered to the side, and after a moment or two, a lamp activated above her, immediately below the rim of the drain entrance. She shielded her eyes against its sudden brightness, and at a word of warning from below, gripped onto the ladder, as with a juddering motion it began to descend. "Here, let me help you, mistress," the robot said, holding out a metal hand. "You saved me, RXL, thank you," Arla said as she stood on wobbly legs in the dim light of the lamp far above. Now she could see that they were at a meeting of several drains. It stank even more down here, and she didn't doubt it would get worse as they moved into the tunnels. RXL held something up to her. "Please use this mask, the oxygen levels in the drains are very low." Arla pulled the mask over her head and drew in a deep breath of fresh air. She raised two thumbs and RXL bobbed his head as if pleased. "I am sorry you had to wait for so long, but the people hunting you were quite insistent with their questioning. I was forced to lead them some way along the road in the direction I said you'd gone, before they'd allow me to return to my station. It was difficult to mislead them, but my primary directive is the preservation of human life, and I did not doubt that they meant you harm." Arla put her arm on the little robot's dented, dirty body, and patted him. "Come, mistress," he said, "your oxygen mask will only provide air for a limited time. We must go to my maintenance chamber. That will be the safest place. Please follow me." Without another word, RXL trundled off into the nearest of the tunnels, Arla following. It turned out she'd been quite out of her reckoning when she'd been topside. She must, despite her best efforts, have deviated to counter, and if she'd carried on as she had been, she'd have reached the edge of no man's land about as far from the access port to the command module as it was possible to be. It had been a long and exhausting journey through this subterranean world. She'd known it existed, but had never stopped to contemplate it. Fortunately, she had complete confidence in her robot guide, and she noticed that when faced with a junction between two tunnels, he always took the one to the right, to clock, and the very center of the valley floor. Finally, they arrived in an underground region that seemed in better repair. It was certainly cleaner, and RXL accelerated his pace as if he was completely familiar with his surroundings now. Sure enough, within minutes they halted outside a circular metal hatch. She hid in the shadows while the robot opened the door and went inside, only moving when he waved her in. "Please sit down," he said as she stepped into the little chamber. There was a dusty chair at a broken table, but no other furniture. The room was dominated by rusty steel racks piled high with boxes, as well as several that had been subdivided into a grid form, each cell containing metal objects. "This is my abode," RXL said. "The masters do not come down here. They issue their orders from the surface, and when they wish to see me in person, which is rare, they call me up to them. I haven't had a visitor for decades. You are safe here." Frankly, Arla was past the point of caring much whether she was safe or not. She pulled the mask off and slumped into the chair, which squeaked as it rolled back a little on its casters. The robot busied himself at a shelf in the corner that it seemed had been converted into a makeshift kitchen. "I anticipated that you might need to hide here, mistress, so I took the liberty of appropriating various items of food, and also this kettle I was asked to repair." Arla leaned back and closed her eyes, relishing the sound of the kettle warming up, and anticipating having something to eat for the first time in it seemed days. "Tell me, XL," she said, eager to scratch the itch of her curiosity despite her exhaustion. "How did you know where I'd be?" The robot didn't pause in his preparations. "We have been watching you, mistress, and communicating your position. I made it my purpose to be the closest to you when you came within my operating region. We? Who's we? The robots of Dawn, mistress. She sat up, suddenly alert. Robots communicate amongst themselves. Yes, mistress, it has always been so. We use a shielded radio frequency. I had no idea, she said. Can you only communicate with other Valley robots? Good grief, you can't contact. Her voice trailed off. She was wondering whether RXL might be a conduit through which to communicate with the officers of Dawn, but she wasn't certain whether she should reveal their nature even to a robot, if it didn't already know. RXL put a mug on the table in front of her. Here, have some tea, he said, ambling back to his kitchenette. He poured something into a pan and began stirring. As he did so, the little room filled with a rich scent of tomatoes. Forgive me, mistress, but what do you know of the officers? Of their nature? He was fishing, she knew it, which meant he knew they were robots. I know they're androids, RXL, if that's what you're asking. Oh, that's excellent, mistress, he said with obvious relief. I can therefore answer your question. The officers are more than just a cadre of robots, they are collectively the mind of Dawn. Arla almost involuntarily swallowed the scalding hot tea she was gently swilling around her mouth. They're what? RXL stopped what he was doing and turned to face her, his red eyes glowing in the gloom. I am a simple maintenance droid, so my knowledge is not complete. There are others here in the valleys who know more of this than I do, but I have been taught to revere the officers, they are the best of us. But what do you mean when you say they're the mind of Dawn? The robot trundled over and deposited a bowl of soup on the table. As I understand it, mistress, it was standard design when Dawn was constructed, to have the ship's systems controlled by the most powerful computer available at the time. Makes sense, Arla said between slurps. Indeed, mistress, RXL responded, standing alongside the table as she ate. But it's also a single point of failure. So the duties of a ship's main computer were distributed amongst the androids, with each officer capable of its main function and at least one backup role. If an officer were to become non-functional over the long centuries, its work could be undertaken by another. Indeed, this has happened twice during the journey, and there is one officer for whom there is no longer any fail-safe. Which one, XL? RXL paused for a moment, as if weighing up the various choices it had against the immutable three laws. Is it important that you know, mistress? I'm the captain, RXL 2006, or had you forgotten? I had not, mistress, he said. R. Patel is the officer. His prime responsibility is for ship-wide maintenance, but since the loss of R. Vandenberg when the dome was compromised 248 years ago, he also controls life support. If he were to be lost, both of those systems would fail, and the crew quarters would soon become uninhabitable. And without the crew, the people of the valleys would also perish, sooner or later. Arla grunted. It would have to be him, wouldn't it? The most robotic of the lot, R. Patel had been, in effect, the day-to-day commander of Dawn for as long as she remembered, probably forever. He had all the personality of a pencil sharpener, and her skin crawled to be near him. And yet he was the most precious object on Dawn. Well, I'd better make sure he's looked after, she said. 11. Kiama. What do you intend to do with Dr. McCall? Kiama asked. She and Debussy sat in the little room he'd commandeered and christened his ready room. It had once been used for equipment storage, but had the advantage of being within comms, so he could sit with the door open and watch his sullen subordinates prepare for the arrival of Relentless. Now, however, the door was closed, and Kiama felt nervous of the bulky man who sat hunched over a tablet, ostensibly checking items on a list. It seemed to her that he'd regressed into the familiar work of a maintenance engineer as a refuge from the responsibilities of command. None of your business, Debussy grunted. She was insubordinate and will pay for that, when I have time for such matters. And if we need her in the meantime. Debussy looked up, his eyes red and rage bubbling under his fixed expression. Well then, we'd better have no more accidents, had we? Kiama sighed and dropped onto the stool opposite the little steel table at which he sat. Jack? Captain, he mumbled as he turned his attention back to the tablet. Are you sure you don't want to share the burden of command? It's exhausting you. And that was the least of its effects on him, she thought. Again the eyes swung lazily up. Don't be an idiot. A captain who shares command isn't a captain at all. Though sometimes I wish you hadn't talked me into it. Your memory of events is different to mine, Kiyama responded, struggling to keep her voice calm. Debussy's face reddened further, but any reply was drowned out by an alarm. Captain Takam's Relentless is approaching. He swept past her, flung the door open, and went to stand behind a young crew member called McClintock, instantly recognizable because of his unusual red hair. Report. McClintock pointed up at the tactical display. They're on an approach vector, Captain, and are requesting permission to land. They're what? Silence. Debussy roared, not even looking as Kiyama shrunk from him. Signal permission granted, he said, watching as McClintock's hands went to the controls. Stop. Kiyama tugged at Debussy's arm. This isn't what we agreed. We said we would negotiate terms, make sure they'll give the prisoners a fair trial. We can't just hand them over like this. Debussy pulled away from her. We don't agree things, I make the decisions here. I'm the captain, not you. Send the signal, crewman. Cancel that order. As one, Debussy, Kiyama, and the other half-dozen personnel in comms turned to see Lieutenant Commander Patel standing in the open doorway, flanked by two other officers, all wearing ship suits. What the hell? I'm captain, not you. Debussy snarled, once the shock of seeing an officer in the flesh had worn off a little. Kiyama could see Patel shaking his head inside the helmet. I am sorry, engineer, but I must relieve you of command. As officers, it is our policy not to interfere with crew matters, and we waited to see if you would prove capable of command, but your decisions are putting Dawn at risk. The Marines aboard Relentless must not be permitted to land until we've made proper security arrangements. Indeed, it is likely that we will not wish for the soldiers of the Vanis Federation to land at all. Debussy, who'd been staring at Patel open-mouthed, suddenly reanimated. You want to be captain, is that it? Then why didn't you just say so? He shouted, pulling a handgun from his belt and pointing it at Patel. No, officers are not permitted to command Dawn, it is against ship procedure. Then it's her. You want her to be captain? Debussy bellowed, grabbing Kiyama by the arm. She struggled ineffectually against his grip. Get off. Patel raised his hands in an attempt to calm the situation. No, engineer, we do not want her to assume command since she is guilty of the same crime of mutiny as you are. Dawn has a captain, and we await her return from the valley. Well, you'll be waiting a long time. Debussy laughed, spraying spittle over Kiyama. She's not coming back from there, the priests have seen to that. Isn't that so, Z? Engineer Z, who'd been watching impassively from a peripheral station, stiffened. I don't know what you mean, he managed. I'm not quite the fool you think I am. You've been in touch with the priests. You put them onto her. You started all this. Don't move. Debussy said, this last statement directed at Patel who, seeing that the gun had turned in Shi's direction, had stepped forward. Dawn has a captain, you say? He hissed, pulling Kiyama close to him. She sure does. Me. Now you'll stand down and go lock yourselves back in your hermetically sealed quarters and leave a real man to do the work. Patel didn't move an inch. I cannot do that, he said. The future of Dawn is at stake. The situation is too dangerous for us to leave it to unravel of its own accord. Dangerous? Maybe, but unless you leave the bridge, it's going to be terminal for you and for this traitor. He pressed the muzzle of the gun against Kiyama's temple. She squealed and tried again to loose herself, but his grip was fueled by rage and there was no escape. Patel stepped back but made no move to leave. Go, I said. Debussy roared. I'll do it, don't think I won't. And you can take that snake with you. He nodded over his shoulder at Z. He's been spying on us for long enough, you watch him for a while. I don't know what you mean, engineer, Patel said. Engineer Z is a trusted member of the crew. Debussy's laugh was close to unhinged. Trusted? He may be trusted, but his real master isn't here. No, he only answers to the P-rhyme. Suddenly Debussy fell to the floor, impaled on a red beam of light emitted from Xi's handgun. And as he fell, he pulled the trigger. Kiyama dropped with him. 12. Escape. Arla woke from a sleep that had been deep but disturbed, leaving her feeling sluggish and disoriented. She opened her eyes and sat up on her elbows to look around. She was lying in a makeshift bed on the floor of RXL's equipment room, but the robot was nowhere to be seen. Rolling over, she hauled herself up and sat at the table. A message lay there, in red letters on a dormant tablet screen. Please eat, I will return shortly. Wait for me here. Beside the tablet was a small bowl containing a chopped banana next to a plate with a thick slice of white bread and a jar of something that looked like peanut butter. She peeled the film from the bowl and tucked in. Never had a slice of fruit tasted so sweet. Bananas were grown in a relatively small area in the central belt of the valley, where the sunlight was strongest, in a grove that had been built into a circular depression to shelter the precious trees. She started in surprise as she heard something moving beyond the door, then sprang from the chair and hid behind some shelving. Within moments, however, she'd relaxed at the characteristic sound of RXL entering the room. Mistress, he said, fear obvious in his voice. Arla stepped out of the shadows. I'm here. That is well, I was concerned you might have left, the robot said. Sitting back at the table, Arla resumed her assault on the banana. I'm not that crazy, she said. I mean, where would I go? Exactly the topic we must discuss. I have been attending to my regular morning duties, and have taken the opportunity to assess the situation on the surface. And? If the robot could have sighed, he would. I'm afraid there remains a state of great vigilance. We must get you as close to the hinterland as we can before you emerge, and then, I fear, we must trust to luck. Arla began attacking the bread, which, although a little stale, tasted sweet enough to her. That's not a great plan, my friend, she said. Perhaps we should wait for the cover of night. RXL's eyes flickered. That will not be possible, mistress. While on the surface, I received a wideband transmission from Lieutenant Commander Patel. It seems you are needed urgently, and any delay in your return might prove catastrophic. I am authorized to use severe methods to ensure your protection. What the hells has happened? Have the Vanis landed? I do not know, mistress. I can only report my instructions, and they are to attempt to return you before noon. A guard has been placed on the hatch, and a detachment of engineers awaits you in the hinterland to escort you back into the command module. It is my job to get you there, and I intend to do my duty. To that end, I have planted an explosive device in this facility, which will detonate in 3 hours, providing, I hope, a distraction as we escape. We must make sure we are far away when it activates. But for now, please finish your breakfast. You are going to need your strength. Arla stumbled as she tried to keep pace with RXL. The robot stopped, his head rotating 180 degrees. Are you injured? He said. No, Arla responded, struggling to her feet. She felt as though they'd been walking for hours, but the only change she'd seen as she followed her guide was that the tunnels were getting narrower and were less well maintained, though the air was fresher. They'd been forced to stop several times lately to clear mud and other debris from their path, and it felt as though, soon enough, they'd have to give up and take to the road above. How much further, XL? I have been forced to take many suboptimal paths, mistress, but I believe we are nearing our exit point. We may have more open ground to cover than I would ideally like, but we must be ready when the charge detonates. Arla wiped down the mud-encrusted pants RXL had given her before they'd left the maintenance room. He'd said that from a distance, she would stand out less if she were dressed in the same manner as the irrigation workers, especially if she was seen walking with a robot of his type. Arla hadn't complained, her peasant clothes were muddy and wet. And anyway, she preferred pants. How did you make sure no one in the building would be harmed? The robot's eyes flickered momentarily. The device is designed to attract attention, not to cause much real damage. The explosion will be extremely loud and much smoke will be emitted, but I have manipulated the duty roster to make it likely that there will be no humans inside when it detonates. I cannot guarantee this, of course, since I cannot entirely rely on my masters to adhere to the schedule, but that risk must be taken, as it is imperative that you are returned to the command module immediately. That's what I don't understand, Arla said. What catastrophe am I the only solution to? I'm just a girl. RXL's head swung backwards and forwards. You are the captain. Judging by what's happened to me since I came back to the valley, I'm captain in name only. And anyway, why not just appoint another? Because you were judged to be the best candidate, I presume. You are the captain, and in times of crisis, your place is in the command module. Arla shook her head. I still don't get it. I have no experience. How can I make life and death decisions? You must make them because we cannot. You must judge between evils, and to do this, you will have to weigh up the value of human lives. My kind cannot do that. If the officers appoint another captain, then they are responsible, at second hand, for any human deaths that result from that appointment. This is why the captain is appointed by his or her predecessor. I have to take responsibility for these decisions, so you don't have to. Regretfully, yes, the robot said as he began moving along the tunnel again. We are products of deliberate human design, and it seems decisions of this nature were deemed inappropriate, or perhaps even dangerous. Arla fell into step behind him. I wonder if those designers ever thought their choices would end up with a 21-year-old farm girl in charge of an Ark ship, facing off against an evil empire. We are here, RXL said, coming to a halt and shining a light upwards to reveal an access port in the roof. A ladder extended almost to the floor, and the robot trundled to a position directly beneath it. The feet of the ladder descended, and with a clunk that echoed around the chamber, attached to sockets on his shoulders. Please allow me to go first, mistress. I will assess the situation, and signal with 2 flashes of my torch for you to follow me. If I do so, I must ask that you make haste. Arla watched him disappear as the ladder slowly compressed. There was a burst of daylight from above as the cover was opened, and then darkness again. She heard the ladder grinding its way down, and reached out to grab the bottom rung, which hung just above the level of her shoulder. Her heart beat so fast it was all she could do to resist the temptation to run into the tunnels and keep running until she found somewhere to hide. But no, she had to see it through. So much apparently depended on her, although she felt she was more the grease that freed up the mechanism of Dawn rather than the rudder that steered the ship. Whatever her role, however, she had to escape capture for long enough to see it through. With a clang, daylight appeared again, and she saw the 2 flashes. She grabbed the rung and with adrenaline-fueled strength and a good deal of swinging backwards and forwards, was able to pull herself up until her feet found purchase. In moments she was out, shielding her eyes from the bright noon sun. And just as she pushed the cover back on the drain, she heard a deep boom, and spun around to see a plume of smoke erupting in the distance. That is the diversion, mistress. Now we must move quickly. This is the perimeter road, and over there, he gestured to his left, over an irrigation ditch that ran parallel to the road, is the hinterland. We must travel approximately 1 kilometer along this road, before we are level with the command module door. You wandered much when you traveled across it before. It is essential that you follow the direct route this time. Without another word, the robot began to walk in his odd seesaw gait, and Arla fell into step alongside him, trying her best to look as though she was a maintenance tech on a routine assignment. And then the cry went up. Go, mistress. Head into the hinterland when you reach the small bridge across the canal, RXL said, before starting off in the opposite direction. Arla sprinted along the road. She didn't even stop when there was a huge bang, and sounds of alarm overtook her. She wondered what had become of RXL, but she didn't slow down. She began to relax, even to exult in the sheer joy of release as she ran over the rough road surface like an uncoiled spring. She saw the bridge to her left as her breathing became more labored. She would make it. And then something stung her in the back of the leg, and she sprawled on her face. She could hear her pursuers call out in triumph, but she pulled herself onto her hands and knees. Then, as she stumbled and fell again, she caught sight of another group approaching from the bridge. She was trapped. Still, she pulled herself upwards, gritting her teeth against the searing pain in her calf. She could feel the blood flowing warm into her boots. She could sense them behind her and considered rolling sideways into the canal and swimming for it, hopeless though that seemed. She saw a noose in her mind's eye tightening on her as second by second, her life came to a close. Her head was cast down as she limped, then darted sideways toward the canal. An arrow spat past her, landing in the grass. She fell. She rolled. The water was just there. And then a hand closed around her arm, a hand with a grip of iron. An incongruous series of fizzes and a volley of cries came from behind her as she tried to twist away. "Be calm, Captain," said Lieutenant Commander Patel in his robotic monotone. "We are here to effect your rescue." She looked up into the most unlikely face she'd ever seen. What the hells are you doing here?" "There is no time for explanation, we must hurry." "Can you walk?" Arla stood up straight and rotated her leg to look at the back. "A glancing blow, I think," Patel said. Arla nodded. "I can manage." Then she caught sight of the bodies. A half-dozen of them strewn across the road. 2 had been shot in the back. "You killed them?" "No, they have been stunned." "It was difficult, but necessary." "Come, we must move." He offered his arm, and she took it. 13. Plot. Arla stood beside Kiama's body and wept. Although it was connected to a life support unit, there was no hope of recovery. The back of Kiama's head had been shattered irreparably, and she lay in a coma she could never hope to emerge from. Arla had been ready to confront her friend, but her anger had turned to grief when Patel had broken the news. He'd waited until they were safely inside the command module, having deflected all questions while they crossed the hinterland at pace. Arla had looked back several times while they stumbled through the rocks and sand toward safety, and she'd have sworn she saw figures following them despite the taboo. Debussy's body lay, unregarded, beneath a black sheet in the tiny mortuary beside sickbay. She'd been wrong about him. She'd considered him nothing more than a boorish idiot, but it seemed she should have added cowardice and ambition to his list of faults. Z was in the brig, occupying the cell previously home to Hal, Lucius and his 2 companions. Patel had released them immediately upon taking temporary command, a strain on his electronics strong enough to persuade him to undertake the dangerous trip across the hinterland to meet Arla. It had been Lucius who'd persuaded him not to wait at the portal, and so, Arla reflected, she owed him her life. Relentless had been trying to re-establish contact for the past several hours as it closed on their position. Patel had ordered radio silence until the captain returned, although, Arla reflected, he couldn't have imagined that she'd have some magical solution to their situation, surely. Maybe he was, in his own robotic way, passing the buck, asking a human to make the tough decisions because he could not. As for the other officers, they had remained safely within their isolated quarters. It seemed they still clung to the idea that it mattered whether their true nature was revealed. Perhaps it did, but for now, all Arla could do was look down at her friend and allow the tears to flow again, whether that was captain-like behavior or not. She'd wanted desperately to sleep, but the situation was, it seemed, as desperate as RXL had suspected. She'd taken half an hour to shower and change into her uniform, reflecting just how much had changed since she'd left it folded on the bed in her quarters. She wasn't using the captain's cabin. Whilst the robots had done a good job of separating Nakajima's remaining organic parts from the machinery and stowing them in the morgue for a formal burial later, it felt right to Arla that she stay in her old, cramped room. Or perhaps it was just that she still felt like a fake. She slumped into a chair, one of many set around a large plastic table. Arla drew in a lungful of coffee odor and lifted the steaming mug to her mouth. Opposite sat Patel, and alongside him were Lucius, Hal, Bex and Naresh Kumar. Dr. McCall sat on the same side of the table as Arla, with engineer Kronka next to her. Kronka had spent the past few days confined to quarters, having, perhaps surprisingly, objected to Debussy's takeover. He'd explained that while it had remained impossible, he'd been happy enough to encourage his former friend, but he'd known what would happen if, somehow, he did gain any power. Like a monkey in a grenade factory, he'd said. It was a prospect you might find funny until it becomes a reality, and you're standing next to it. Kronka had been appointed head of internal security by Patel, and 2 other Dawn engineers completed the party, neither of whom Arla knew very well. Alamini Mwangi was a structural specialist and the oldest active engineer, while Maria Weber was the lead EVA instructor. An odd assortment, thought Arla. For an odd situation, and a deadly one. It's time for complete honesty, Arla said, noting with grim satisfaction how many of them tensed at those words. Patel, in particular, seemed to stiffen, as if his cognitive pathways were feverishly calculating the consequences of all the possible outcomes of her next sentence. Some of you might be wondering why we haven't yet simply handed over our prisoners to the Vanis. After all, there's at least a chance that they'd leave us alone if we did. A small chance. No chance, Lucia said. The Vanis are intent on revenge. Arla held her hand up to silence him. It felt good. You're hardly objective, Chancellor. And you're hardly informed, he responded sharply. I know these people. I have lived among them for many years. Whether you hand us over or not, they will seek to take possession of Dawn. They'll execute the crew, enslave the people of the valleys, and steal your robots. With them, they'll become the most powerful force in this part of the galaxy. Whatever. The truth is that I was always reluctant to hand Hal over, but I was ready to do so if it increased our chances of survival. But Hal is more than the incompetent smuggler he appears to be. Arla gestured at Hal, who sat with a resigned expression. Will you introduce us to Ace, please? I am here, said Ace in Hal's voice. Ace is an AI currently residing in an implant within Hal's brain. She's the reason he's here. He stole her from a Vanis laboratory. His ship, and the orb that previously housed her, is on the surface of Dawn. She is what the Vanis want back above all. She's the most advanced of her kind in this part of the galaxy, and she's our ticket out of here. Isn't that right, Ace? Affirmative, Ace Hal said, not even attempting to cloak the pride in her voice. I, and only I, can plot you a multiple jump course out of this system. A course that no Vanis ship will be able to follow. I can take you to safety if you make it to the gate. McCall interrupted. I've heard about these gates, but do they really link the stars together? Yes, Lucia said. I have traveled the gate array myself. With human pilots, we can jump from one system to the next, but then must recalculate our flight path before jumping again. Our genius AI here claims she can plot a multi-step trajectory that cannot be followed by any human. And do you believe her? Arla asked, turning to Lucius. The older man nodded. Yes, I do. I have researched the capabilities of the old ice, and it is these navigational skills that make her so valuable to the Vanis. Imagine if they could send ships halfway across the galaxy. They could attack without warning and escape into the grid. Sufficiently disguised, they could enrich themselves without any of their victims knowing who was behind the piracy. And then, when they were strong enough, they could expand their empire in every direction. That sort of regime is not one I would welcome. That's pretty rich coming from you, Ace Hal said. I have accessed the records on the Nox, and you are responsible for some of the worst brutalities of the Federation. Am I indeed? The truth is often twisted by those who report it, Lucius responded coolly. I did what had to be done to preserve order because that, even when maintained by force, is better than the chaos that threatens to engulf the petty kingdoms of humankind. That is a new dark age I do not wish to see. Mwangi cleared his throat and leaned forward. If I am understanding correctly, he said, running his hands through his short gray beard like a prognosticating sage, our only hope of escape is to make it to the gate which I believe is in close orbit around this system's star. That's about the size of it, Arla said, slightly irritated by the old man's deliberate pace. So the question is, can we hold off our attackers until then? That's your problem, Ace Hal snapped. Get me to the gate and I'll save you. Mwangi chuckled merrily. You are a charmer and no mistake, he said. But how long would it take us to get there? Has anyone performed the calculation? Approximately 36 hours if we burn every kilo of fuel on Dawn, Beck said. I've studied the specs and we need to start spinning up the reactive drive ahead of any change in trajectory, so we need the order now. Arla looked from Ace Hal to Lucius. You know the Vanis military better than anyone here, she said. Can we hold them off for a day and a half? Unlikely if they come in determined force. Whatever happens, McCall said, they mustn't be allowed to access the valleys. Can you imagine the chaos that would cause? We'd never be able to put that genie back in its bottle. Arla nodded. Yes, it was bad enough that a handful of them saw Commander Patel and the others. If a platoon of Space Marines suddenly appears out of the hinterland, that would be the end of any chance we have of preserving the old order. I think we are beyond that point already, Lucius said. Whatever happens over the course of the next few days, Dawn's mission is coming to an end. It would be better if that were handled in an ordered way, certainly, but one way or another, the life of the Valley people is about to change forever. Patel stirred. I have asked Engineer Muller to be here, as she is the EVA specialist. I have consulted with her regarding methods by which we might delay any onslaught. Our primary goal must be to prevent the enemy gaining control of comms and the engine control room, she said, not waiting for any further introduction. Ideally, we should attempt to keep them confined to the airlock complex, since there is only one way from there to the command module, and if they were to break through into that, there would be little we could do to prevent them reaching the valleys. As a backup plan, I suggest we must be prepared to booby-trap the CM, and if necessary, sacrifice it. Arla went to respond, but as she opened her mouth to speak, the door rolled open and McClintock's red head peered in. Captain, he said, you're needed. Now. 14. Ultimatum. You command the crew. Where is Debussy? NZ. The ancient face on the monitor in what had been Debussy's ready room was peering into the screen as if he could crawl through and see for himself. Arla nodded. She'd become used to the derision she experienced whenever someone older than her discovered that she was in charge. Part of her understood, and seeing the situation from their perspective, was prepared to be patient. As time had gone on, however, she'd found her patience coming to an end, and frankly, she could barely give a rat's ass anymore. Let them think what they like, she decided. Debussy's insurrection had shown that most of the crew were so respectful of hierarchy, they'd follow the orders of anyone brave enough to seize power. Add to that Arla's undisputed legitimacy, and she felt she had nothing to fear on that score. This old man, on the other hand, had managed to get on her nerves in the space of one sentence. Debussy was a mutineer and is now dead, Holiness, she said, and Z is in the brig on a murder charge. What interest do you have in either, may I ask? Yes, she knew who he was all right. She'd seen Prime's portraits hanging in the seminary. But 3 years and a metric ton of the brown stuff had somewhat dissipated the fear and respect that had been instilled by her training. Interesting. For a moment, as she relayed this news, she saw surprise and concern on Prime's face. Only for a moment, before the mask came down again. I ask merely as an interested party, and the prime link between the people of the valleys and the exalted engineers. Lieutenant Commander Patel informed me of the change of captain and the circumstances in which it took place, but he did not tell me you were so young. Arla smiled. And Z? What's your interest in him? He was a promising student who might have been Prime himself one day, Prime said, shrugging. Please explain the circumstances of his arrest. I wasn't there, Arla said. But Patel told me that he fired when Debussy was about to reveal something that Z, presumably, would prefer didn't become known. There it was. Just a flicker of fear. Now, I wonder what secret this former high-flying priest would so fear being revealed that it would compel him to kill someone and condemn himself publicly. Prime feigned disinterest. I couldn't begin to imagine. Really? Then I guess I'm forced to draw my own conclusions. Now, unless you have anything specific you wish to discuss, Holiness, I am very busy. Arla went to disconnect the call, but Prime held up his hand. "There is one thing," he said, glancing down at a strip of paper in his hand. "The matter of the charges against you." Arla laughed out loud. "Seriously? Well, at least we've established how Elias knew I was in the valley that day. I presume Z passed on that little nugget. You are accused of heresy and must stand trial." "No one is above the rule of law," Prime said with rising confidence. Arla felt a chill run through her gut. "I really don't have time for this," she snapped. "You have no idea what we're facing." "Oh, indeed I do. I know all about the Vanis Federation, and it seems to me better to seek an alliance with them than to be ruled over by a heretic. I'm cutting this off now, Prime, and I suggest you stick to religious matters from now on and leave the rest to us." Again, she leaned forward to cut off the connection. "Jabe Farmer," Prime said. "Do you know him?" "Dad?" Prime smiled. "Indeed. We have him, and unless you hand yourself over to our justice, he will be tried in your stead and will suffer the consequences of your crimes. Come back to the valley, Captain, or your father will burn." "Do you believe him?" Lucius asked. Arla thought for a moment. She was sitting in the galley with a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. Lucius sat opposite her next to a vacant-looking Hal, released, it seemed, from Ace's control. "It's hard for me not to," Arla responded. "He's Prime after all. He has almost total power over the valleys. Given what Lieutenant Commander Patel has told me about the connection between the command module and the cloister, as I believe you term the part of Dawn that houses the priests, it seems to me that any Prime must be a consummate liar. After all, on becoming the chief priest, the truth of Dawn is revealed, and thereafter, the Prime must lie every day of his life, knowing that his religion is false." Arla swallowed a mouthful of bitter coffee, giving herself time to think. Perhaps, but then he would also know that whether true or not, the faith brings order and hierarchy to the people. "Indeed," Lucius said, smiling, "an ingenious solution to the problem of controlling many people in a confined space. True freedom in this ship in a bottle would be disastrous. But in any case, whether justified or not, this only serves to demonstrate that any Prime must be comfortable with falsehood and adept at propagating it. So I repeat, how can you be sure he isn't lying?" "I can't be certain, but my heart says he's telling the truth. And in any case, I can't take the risk." Lucius' face hardened. "But you are the captain now. With Relentless preparing to attack us at any moment, this is the worst time for the commander to go absent. We can't, after all, put any of the officers in charge. Yes, I know of their nature." "How?" Arla felt as though her grip on herself was loosening, her mind racing to keep up with every shifting circumstance. It wasn't difficult to work out. Why else would they refuse to depose Debussy? Why indeed would they allow you to be captain in the first place when Lieutenant Commander Patel has far more experience, at least 1,300 years more, I should imagine? "And in any case," he continued, as Arla sat stony-faced, "it is obvious when you study Patel. He is a masterpiece of classical engineering, but he is not quite a totally convincing human, is he?" Arla dragged her gaze from Lucius' steel-gray eyes to Hal. "Did you tell him?" "What?" Hal said, as if waking from sleep. "Sorry, I wasn't listening." "Seriously? What's wrong with you? It only seems 5 minutes ago you were standing alongside me in the captain's quarters." Hal rubbed his eyes. "Sorry. It's just when she comes out, it craps me for ages. And it's getting worse. I can see that, you look like death." "It is the AI," Lucius said. "She is drawing energy from his implant, and that in turn is draining his body. Standard implants in these decadent times are not as efficient as they once were, and I suspect the boy's one is cheap and poor even by today's standards. I wouldn't be surprised if it isn't directly converting glucose, as well as other trace elements, to fuel itself." "What can we do about it?" Arla asked, suddenly all concern. "How did she get into the implant in the first place?" "Electrical transfer through his hands, but that is of little help since, unless she cooperates, we will be unable to force her to leave, at least not by that route. I think, for now, and given the current crisis, the best we can do is ask that she only activates her override when she must, and only then for the briefest of periods." Arla turned to Hal. "Are you there, Ace?" she said, feeling just a little foolish. "Will you communicate through Hal, unless it is absolutely necessary to take control? Tell her she's an impertinent fool. I'll do what I want when I want." "She says okay," Hal muttered. "Good," Arla said. "Now, what are we going to do about my father?" Lucius shrugged. "As I said, you are the captain. You must put aside your personal feelings for the greater good." "Crack you." Arla leapt to her feet and thrust a shaking finger in the Chancellor's face. "I've had just about enough. Of you, of the Vanis, of that arrogant scum in the cloister." She noticed herself shrieking, but she didn't stop. She allowed the rage and fear to engulf her, and roared at Lucius as he sat, staring up at her, entirely unmoved except that his eyes had almost imperceptibly widened. "This is not a negotiation," she said, dropping back into the chair opposite the Chancellor and Hal, who it seemed hadn't noticed a thing. "My father comes first, and once he is safe, I can concentrate on the defense of Dawn. And only then." Lucius shook his head. "And if rescuing him dooms us all?" "We'd better see that it doesn't," Arla said. "Send him to get your father," Hal said, pointing at Lucius. "After all, he's the one with experience of negotiating. And he's hardly going to be any use to us, is he? I can't imagine him holding a pulse rifle." Lucius went to open his mouth in protest, but Arla got there first. "You're right," she said. "He can negotiate and, at the very least, keep them from harming my father until we've dealt with the Vanis." "You speak as if that's a minor matter," Lucius responded hotly. "I think you'll find that once they land, you'll need everyone you can get your hands on to help, especially someone with experience of the Vanis military. Bex will stand in for you. She knows more about how they'll attack than anyone here, and I imagine she's pretty dangerous when cornered." Lucius stood up. "This is madness. I am needed here." "No," Hal said, though in that one syllable Arla knew that Ace was in control. "You are not required here. Your particular talents will be of more use in the valleys, and the sooner you get there, the better." For a moment the two glared at each other, as if frozen in a battle of wills. And then, remarkably, it was Lucius who assented. "I shall go," he said. "Perhaps, as you say, I can help our cause more from there than here." "Good. And bear in mind that failure is not an option," Arla said. "You will return to the command module with my father, alive and well, or you won't return at all. Do I make myself clear?" Lucius held her gaze for a moment before lowering his eyes and nodding. Arla turned and left the room, wondering why she felt as though her victory, in the end, had come too easily. She had the impression she'd missed something in that exchange between Lucius and ACE. Something important. But her mind wouldn't allow her to settle enough to consider the matter. Lucius knew the stakes, and he was, after all, the most equipped of them all to negotiate on their behalf. He would go, and she had other tasks to attend to. There was no longer any room for the luxury of uncertainty. 15. Death Star. Scout should have been proud. Today she was to be the eyes and ears of Core, of the entire robot empire. She should have been proud, but she was in fact terrified. She had been ordered to observe the engagement from a safe distance, but there was no way to know what that actually meant. In the end, she'd decided for herself that the closer to the gate she was, the better, and so she was orbiting this system's sun and absorbing as much energy as she could, so that, like a rabbit in the grass, she could spring away at the first sign of danger. And anyway, the further she was from the grunts, the better. Core had deployed 4 ships of the line to put a stop to the inexorable and destructive progress of the intruder. It was still far from Core itself and would at this rate take many months before it threatened the heart of the robot empire, but it had already destroyed 5 outposts and its path was unmistakable. The 4 battleships were newly constructed, but 3 contained experienced intelligences that had dwelt within Core. The 4th was a newborn, having been created as the first of a new breed of tactical ice, as Core sought to create robotic antibodies against future incursions. For now its role was to play second fiddle, to observe and learn, But Scout could see it was desperate to get in on the action and not be a mere bystander. Fool, she thought, wait till you've seen it. Really seen it. Scout received a microwave burst from the fleet. Xander 1358, this is BS-ROM 001, codename Horatio. Do you receive? Acknowledged, BSROM 001. Am holding position. Sensors recording on all wavelengths. Plan Trafalgar initiated, said the digital pulse. It was an odd mix of arrogance and lingering subservience that had led the robot ships to adopt the names of long-dead human admirals. Horatio Nelson, Yi Sun-sin, and Isoroku Yamamoto were the senior three, whereas the fledgling had called itself Picard, though Scout could find no mention of him in her memory banks. Scout focused her sensors on the fourth planet in the system. The sun she was sheltering beside was a red dwarf with only 4 planets, 2 rocky and 2 gaseous. One of the gas giants was so large it had been within an ace of igniting and turning this into a dim binary system. There was a gate because the second of the rocky planets was rich in rare metals, and a refinery had been built there. A refinery that no longer existed. Predictably, the intruder was in orbit around the huge, smoldering giant planet and had shown no indication that it had detected the robot ships closing in on it. They were adopting a battle line formation, approaching the intruder, so the maximum number of guns would be trained on it. However, she knew the plan was to attempt to communicate with it first, to establish its motives. As far as she was concerned, this was a dangerous waste of time. She'd seen inside its hybrid mind and found nothing but hate there. She detected the microwave pulses sent by Horatio as the 4 robot ships approached. We come in peace. Declare your purpose. And then she felt the intruder's attention turn from the gas giant onto them, momentarily sweeping over her like a distant lighthouse beam that froze her circuits. Such was the speed and ferocity of the response to their request for parley that Sun-sin and Yamamoto didn't even have time to emit a mayday. Scout's sensors detected a massive X-ray burst and they were gone. Horatio fired a volley of its cannons and, where it hit the intruder, like air from a balloon, exotic radiation flowed outwards for just a few milliseconds before it seemed it healed itself. Moments later, another X-ray burst and Horatio, mid-volley, went silent. The last thing she heard before fleeing into the gate was the piteous scream of Picard, as like a cat playing with a mouse, the intruder disintegrated him piece by piece. 16. Invasion. The exterior camera swung round to follow the Relentless's landing craft as it touched down beside Hal's ship, the Nox. Arla, Hal, McClintock, and McCall were the only humans in comms to see this. R. Patel and R. Sanchez stood in the shadows. Kronka, status reports, she said, speaking into her suit microphone. Her helmet lay on the console, ready to be put on at a moment's notice. It seemed likely enough that the first objective for the Marines of Relentless would be to depressurize the crew section once they'd broken in through the airlock, so every last ship suit had been issued and every crew member given a sidearm. Frankly, in a fair fight, they'd stand no chance against the trained Marines, but they had the advantage of home territory and they didn't have to win the battle, just delay them long enough for Dawn to reach the gate. We're ready, Captain, Kronka said over the suit speakers. The airlock is booby-trapped, as is the corridor. We've prepared points to retreat to. And the surprise is locked and loaded. Well done, I'll let you know when to expect visitors. Kronka signed off and Arla turned to Hal, who was sitting at the engineering console. How soon before rocket burn? Hal looked up at her. I'm still adjusting the thruster positioning. Commander Patel has been assisting, but these motors haven't been fired in anger in a long time, he tells me, and we'll only get one chance. Once the captain of Relentless realizes what we're doing, he'll try to destroy the thrusters, and we need to be on course before they attempt that. So how soon? Arla persisted. An hour maybe, Hal said, shrugging. I'm just the grunt here, and I'm working for 2 masters, that one over there and another one in here. He pointed at Patel, who was hovering over a readout, and to his head, where Ace was, Arla imagined, chattering incessantly at him. They're coming, McCall said, gesturing at the display from the external camera. An opening had appeared on the side of the landing craft, and a line had been attached to the side of Dawn's airlock. Silver-suited figures began filing down the ramp and along the line. "Get me relentless," Arla said. McClintock punched the connection through, using the protocols Kiama had established mere days ago, when the nightmare had truly begun. A face emerged out of the static. "This is Captain Indy of Relentless. Stand down and prepare to surrender." "This is Captain Arla Nakajima of Dawn," Arla said, with the best pretense of confidence she could manage. "Your landing craft is violating our sovereign territory. We give you this one warning to recall your Marines or we will be forced to take deadly action." Indy's face broke into a smile. "Even if you had the capability to carry out any threat, you would not be foolish enough to swat at the Vanis Federation. The consequences would be deadly. Believe me, Captain, I'm foolish enough. But in the spirit of cooperation, I will tell you that the terrain your Marines are walking toward has been seeded with mines. I suggest you recall them for their own safety." "Safety? They're Marines. Danger is their business," Indy snarled with contempt. Arla shrugged. "Perhaps, but not unnecessary danger. Recall them and clear the area if you must, but don't allow them to walk blindly into a minefield. They will follow their orders." "So be it," Arla said. "You may wish to know, incidentally, that we've been broadcasting over a wide spectrum, so your Marines and their commanders will have heard every word I've said. They will also know, by the fact that you haven't ordered them to clear the field before proceeding, that you are content for them to be sacrificed in the name of stubborn arrogance." Indy's face loomed large in the display. "You're lying, there are no mines." "Then take the chance. Fortunately, it's not your life you're risking, not yet at any rate." She nodded at McClintock who, at the prearranged sign, cut off the connection. Arla collapsed into her seat and breathed out. "Now we'll see whether they've bought it." "Oh, I think so," McCall said, pointing at the external display. The Marines had stopped moving forward, and those at the rear were edging back to the ship. "You gambled on his base cowardice overriding every other consideration, including the real likelihood that we had any mines, much less that we'd use them. Well done, round one to you." Rubbing her temple to ward off the headache she could feel building, Arla took a swig of coffee. "Let's hope it buys us enough time." "Captain, I'm receiving an alert from R. Lanval," McClintock said. "Lanval? Isn't he a maintenance droid?" McClintock nodded. "It is, yes, sir. It was assigned to accompany Chancellor Lucius through the North Valley portal and await his return." Panic kicked Arla in the gut. "Put him on, quick." R. Lanval, report. "Captain, urgent," the robot said in its clipped, precise voice. It was designed, somewhat like RXL, to operate on its own initiative in some of the most inaccessible and dangerous parts of the ship, and its communication didn't have the polished, human-like quality of R. Patel, who, despite spending more time with the crew than he was comfortable with, had yet to be uncovered. "What's happened?" "The Chancellor has been abducted, Captain. He ordered me most insistently to report to you, rather than attempt his rescue. It was difficult to comply." Arla thumped the back of McClintock's chair. "Damn it, robot. Tell me what happened, and make it quick." "I am sorry, Captain. I will attempt to summarize. I accompanied the Chancellor to the portal. I was to remain inside to readmit him when he returned. But as he stepped through, he was assaulted by men who had hidden against the wall so we could not see them when we looked out. He ordered me to shut the portal, and I did so, although I'm afraid I might have injured one of the humans as he attempted to step inside. And now they beat upon the portal, many hands. I find it quite uncomfortable to disobey them, as they instruct me to open the door." R. Lanval, deactivate yourself immediately, Arla snapped. "Captain, I was instructed to await the return of the Chancellor." "I command here," Arla said, "and you will follow my instructions. Deactivate yourself now." After a momentary pause, the robot resumed, "Acknowledged, Captain. Going offline. Dr. McCall. Please go down to the North Valley portal and monitor the situation from there." "Are you serious?" McCall said. Arla nodded. I can't go, I'm needed at the airlock. So am I. I'm a doctor for the love of the goddess. I know, but something's going on down there and that scum priest is behind it. Somehow, he's persuaded some hotheads that the hinterland is no longer taboo and that we're the threat. If they get in, then we might as well jump into one of the transports and fly into the sun, because dawn will be over. Arla drew in a deep breath. Look, I can't be in both places and I need someone I can trust by the door. Be careful and let me know if it looks as though they'll break in. But how can they? They've only got agricultural tools. And industrial robots, Doctor. And the means of making explosives, if they're given that sort of information. Right now, I don't think there's anything Prime wouldn't do to get them in here and take over control. It wouldn't surprise me if he hasn't cut a deal with the Vanis, through Z. Now go. McCall headed for the door just as the gantry shook. McClintock pointed to the video feed. They're using explosives to clear the minefield. A plume of superheated gas spread across the surface of the asteroid and toward the airlock door. Arla crouched behind the makeshift barricade and squinted at the monitors piled in the corner. Each showed a different view of the landscape outside so she and the others here could keep their heads down without losing sight of their attackers. There had been no mines, of course. Dawn had been sent into virgin space without armament, much less anything that could, in the wrong hands, jeopardize the ship's integrity. The designers thought they'd imagined every eventuality into the far distant future of the mission, and yet had not anticipated the interstellar gate technology that had made their plans obsolete while dawn was creeping across the void between stars. Having established that there was no minefield, the Marines were now approaching in single file, hitched to the lines strung between the landing craft and the airlock. It was an odd consequence of the fact that she and the airlock were on the outer rim of the asteroid that the Marines were approaching at right angles to her, as if they were crawling across a roof and were about to enter through a loft window. Kronka watched her as his finger hovered on the big red button in his hand. Now? Honestly, Stan, I don't have a clue. You're the closest we've got to a military tactician, you decide. I can't do that, Captain, he said. You have to give the order. He was right, of course. As soon as she told him to go ahead, they would be committing an act of war, and any chance they might have had to talk their way out would be gone. In truth, however, they were past the point of negotiating. Way past. Do it. Kronka glanced at one of the monitors. The leading Marines were barely 50 meters from the airlock. Without hesitating, he punched down on the button. Instantly, silently, dust exploded to fill the display as the rock about their heads vibrated. After a few moments, it gently dissipated. Arla reached over and cranked up the contrast. Where there had been a small valley with a line running along it, there was now nothing but a heap of rocks cut through here and there by gray streaks, the limbs of half-buried soldiers. Some of them were moving fitfully. By the goddess, Kronka muttered. Gritting her teeth, Arla hauled herself up. Right, we've got a breathing space, at least until they work out that we've just played our one card, at least before they get in here. Well done, Maria. EVA. Specialist Weber's eyes were fixed on the monitor and the things writhing in a now unfamiliar landscape. She slowly shook her head, hardly seeming to notice as the others left her alone to watch. One by one, all movement ceased, and the asteroid surface was, as far as the cameras could see, dead. And then something rolled into view, at the top of the monitor's field of vision. She knelt and squinted at the grainy image as the vehicle slowly bumped over the rubble, heedless of what it crushed beneath its huge pneumatic tires. It stopped halfway down the screen, roughly 200 meters from the airlock. A shape emerged from the body of the vehicle, rising on a flat bed until it stood proud of the wheelbase. It was conical in shape, and Weber watched as it swung slowly, first horizontally, and then very gently, it dipped down, until it appeared to be looking straight at the monitor. Missile, she called, and after grabbing her helmet she ran for her life. 17. Revolution. Lucius was shoved into the community building, and left swaying in the gloom as he stood before a long, low table. He'd been marched, poked and occasionally dragged at high speed to what looked like an agri-chemical plant. It had been an uncomfortable journey, though his inquisitive mind had sucked in every detail of this fascinating place. In all his years of researching the missions of the Ark ships, he'd never imagined he would ever set foot in one, much less one that still functioned as intended. He corrected himself. Dawn had been, almost miraculously, a working agrarian society ready to colonize a new planet, but then it had encountered the Vanis Federation, and it seemed to him this had somehow broken the fragile balance. On the surface, life in the valley seemed to be carrying on as normal. Robots and humans worked in the fields, and aside from the rabble who'd abducted him, there was no sign of conflict or anything amiss. But the place had a febrile atmosphere, as if it were a petrol-soaked rag being held close to a match. He only hoped that he wouldn't be the igniter. He stood alone in the center of the room, listening to the murmuring of the people sitting behind him on rows of benches. Heretic. He heard that word being mumbled over and over. A door swung open to reveal a candle-lit corridor, and a man walked in. His stiff white vestments whispered, as he glided along the table to stand beside the chair set exactly at its center. Another man rushed from the shadows and pulled the chair back before bowing his head as Prime took his seat. It was obviously him, though Lucius had never seen the man before. The veneration of all those around him said as much, and he couldn't imagine any of the simple inhabitants of the valley owning such a fine garment. It was the look of triumph that sealed it. It reminded Lucius of a snake that had cornered a mouse and was relishing a little sport before it struck. "Declare yourself," Prime said in a clear and confident voice that carried across the entire room. "You are not Arla Farmer." "Obviously," Lucius said. Deference was not in his nature, and in any event, he decided it would be unlikely to help him with this opponent. "My name is Marco Lucius, and I function at present as the representative of the Blessed Engineers." The murmur rose in intensity, until Prime raised his hand and silence fell again. "Bring the prisoner forward so this man can see what is at stake." Lucius turned as a door opened to his left. Out of the darkness shuffled a broken man, leaning on a disheveled robot. This man sheltered a heretic, and for that, he shall pay the full penalty of the law. "Are you the father of Arla Farmer?" Lucius asked. "Yes," the man said without looking up. Is she alive?" "She was when I left her." Now the man raised his haggard face. "And is what she told me true?" "Though I know in my heart that it is." Silence. Prime rose to his feet, and two guards dragged the man away on his heels, and perhaps no one noticed the little nod Lucius gave as they did so. There will be no more public heresy. Prime fell back in his chair and shot a challenging glance at Lucius. "Indeed. It seems to me prudent for now that the current dogma concerning the nature of the world should remain unchallenged. For now." Prime's shoulders fell just a little at this. Good, thought Lucius, he wishes to preserve the illusion too. "Do you come, then, to answer the charges laid before Arla Farmer? Is she too cowardly to do so herself?" Lucius allowed himself the luxury of a thin smile. "She is otherwise occupied. You are aware of the wider situation, I believe. You therefore know that our world is under threat. The only threat comes from her and those who follow her." "In that you are incorrect," Lucius said. Again, Prime jumped to his feet. "I am not wrong, I cannot be wrong. It is blasphemy to suggest such a thing, and you, Marco Lucius, have perjured yourself in so doing. You will languish in the same cell as the man you came to save, while I decide whether you shall share his fate." The two men who'd stepped toward him stopped as Lucius raised his hand. "Holiness, you have an opportunity to serve the world in a way that will be remembered for generations to come, for the right reasons. Or you can risk the plan set out by the Blessed Engineers just as it approaches fruition." Fruition? Who are you to lecture me, the most holy, on such matters? Heresy upon heresy, your own lips condemn you. Take him away. "Holiness, I beg you to reconsider," Lucius said as strong hands grabbed him. "Everything is at stake." If Prime made any reply, it was lost in the uproar that swept across the room as Lucius was marched toward the inner door. With a thump it swung shut, and he was plunged into darkness and silence. The faint hope that he could reason with Prime had proven to be vain, and his mind whirled as it visualized all the possible paths into the future. And all of them were dark. It was also dark in the cell he shared with Jabe Farmer, the only light coming from the corridor beyond the door's open hatch and the flickering glow of the robot's eyes. It had been just over an hour since he'd been shoved into what was obviously a converted storeroom, and the community building was now empty and quiet, though outside many voices could be heard, as if a crowd had gathered. He had said nothing to the others, indicating with a gesture that they were not to interact, not yet, at least. Lucius listened to the regular thump-thump of footsteps approaching the door, then looked up as eyes appeared at the hatch and after a moment swept away. "We may speak now, I think," he said. "They are checking on us every 10 minutes, a response, I imagine, to your daughter's escape." Jabe lifted his head and a weak smile played across his face. "That's my girl." "RDJ, do you believe that there are any concealed listening devices?" "I can detect no electromagnetic signatures. Except... That's odd." Lucius grabbed the robot's arm. "We don't have much time. If there are no bugs, we must decide quickly what we're going to do." "What can we do?" Jabe whispered. "Do you know what Prime plans?" "Make examples of us, I suppose." "I don't mean his plans for us, Farmer." RDJ's neck made a grinding noise as it brought the robot's flickering eyes to bear on Lucius. "Please do not stress my master," he said. "He is not well, and I can answer your questions at least as well as he can." "Then do so," Lucius snapped. "It seems plain to me that Prime is raising the valley against the engineers for reasons I have yet to calculate. You can hear them outside. It is possible that revolt is also being fomented in the South Valley, though I have no way of knowing this. There is great anger that Mistress Arla escaped her punishment as a priest and returned to the valley. But that charge was a fabrication." DJ nodded. "Yes, but the priests control what the people of the valleys are told, and their version of the truth is distorted. To the people, Arla is a criminal." "What about the other engineers, though?" "Prime has convinced the priests and through them the people that the engineers have been infiltrated by others like Arla and that they have fallen from grace. He claims that if Dawn is to survive the wrath of the goddess, the command module must be purged of evil and new, worthier candidates elevated to the status of engineers." In the darkness, Lucius smiled grimly. "He wants to be captain and his chief priest to be his lieutenants. It's as simple as that. He wants ultimate power over Dawn." "I believe you are correct," DJ said as he glanced down at the half-asleep figure of Jabe who was sitting knees under his chin on the filthy wooden floor of their cell. "But regardless of these wider matters, my master is sick and grows weaker. He is my concern, my only concern." "I understand," Lucius said softly. "It is hard to see him like this, but we must consider the greater good. He is one man who, if events carry on as they are, will die anyway." DJ shook his metal head. "You do not understand the laws of robotics. I cannot by action or inaction allow any harm to come to Master Farmer, and so I must wait here by his side and seek to comfort him as I may." "If you will not help me, Dawn is finished," Lucius said, reaching out to take DJ's hand. The robot fell senseless to the floor. 18. Assault. Arla sprayed blood across the wall before wiping her mouth and gingerly pressing against the tear in her lip. The explosion had thrown her to the floor, and she'd been forced to twist her helmet into place before she could staunch the flow. 5 minutes with a mouthful of blood had been the least of her problems, however. She'd barely made it to the hatch before the explosive decompression seized her and began dragging her out toward the massive rip in the superstructure. Hal had been waiting for her, keeping the hatch open until the last possible moment before grabbing her as she slipped backwards. "I guess that makes us even," he said as they stood panting inside the closed door, safe for now. Arla didn't answer. She wiped her lip again on the back of her ship suit and glanced around. A handful of engineers waited nervously, some sitting on the metal floor, some standing, no one talking. A small monitor above the door showed the corridor outside, but that was their only view. "Where's Weber?" she said, suddenly realizing who was missing. Kronka, who was squatting against a wall, stood up. "She ran into one of the tripwires," he said, drawing a line across his neck. Arla was too numb to know how to react. "I need to get to comms," she said. "I have to see what they're up to." "You know what to do." Kronka nodded. Me and the forlorn hope here," he said, gesturing at 3 others, "will finish rigging up this corridor. It's the only way through to comms, so we should be able to buy you a little time." "Save the melodrama, Stan," Arla said, holding out her hand. "Rig it to blow, then get yourself back to the next bottleneck." She was just turning to go when she was thrown backwards as the corridor seemed to lurch from under her feet. "I didn't hear an explosion," Kronker said. Arla treated herself to a half-smile. "That's the attitude thrusters kicking in. Patel must be finally happy with the sequence." "I told him my calculations were correct," Hal said. "Well, her calculations to be exact." Heading off at speed, Arla beckoned him to follow. "The clock's now ticking," she said. "We have to keep them at bay long enough to make it to the gate. Then we'll see how keen they are to go on an interstellar journey with us." "Just keep them off for 36 hours? Kronka muttered. "Piece of cake." Fully half of the displays in comms were dead, their cameras presumably blasted by the Marines to cloak their approach. They hadn't found them all, however, and by some miracle, the feed from outside the secondary hatch was still live. White-suited figures walked with efficient purpose along the corridor, as 2 of their colleagues examined the hatch. Arla could see a toolbox whose markings suggested it contained explosives, and sure enough, one of the 2 specialists opened the box, reached inside, and carefully removed something small and round that stuck to the hatch. "Better hurry, Kronka," Arla muttered, then turned to Bex, who was sitting at the attitude control console. "How long do we have to keep them off for?" "It's still 36 hours, she said, "and it would have been longer if that idiot officer of yours had had his way." "Where is Patel?" Bex looked up at him. "I ordered him to take a hike." "You ordered him?" "Someone had to make a decision. I guess what makes a good officer during a long interstellar mission isn't what's needed when the brown stuff hits the fan." "And he just went?" Bex shrugged and bent over the attitude console. "Yep. Said he'd confer with the other officers. I assumed he was snitching on me." "Kumar," she said, and for the first time Arla noticed the diminutive geek hunched over a display a few yards away. "How's the fuel consumption looking?" Naresh Kumar shook his head without looking up. "I'm not happy. The margin of error is less than 1%. Just as well we've got a bona fide genius like you with us, isn't it?" The technician ignored her, his eyes transfixed by the tumbling numbers on his display. Arla peered over his shoulder. She was an engineer and comfortable enough with math, but she could make neither head nor tail of what she was seeing. "It's his own notation," Beck said, glancing up from her readout, "a sort of shorthand for the weird calculus he's using to plot our course." "I thought Ace was providing all that." Beck shook her head. "Oh, there's no doubt she could do it, but then so can he, and I know who I trust more. Give me something with blood in its veins any day. Even Kumar over there, and he's half robot." "No wonder you and Patel didn't get on," thought Arla, "and why he left. He was obeying an order from a human." A sudden bang and light flared in the monitor outside the hatch. When it cleared, the door was gone and Marines began running down the corridor. Another bang, and 2 bodies were thrown back to smash into the wall below the camera. "Yes?" Arla said, clenching her fist. And then catching herself. She was celebrating the efficient killing of a Marine squad. What was she becoming? "Captain." She was snapped back to reality by McClintock. "It's Dr. McCall. She sounds pretty panicky." "Put her on." "Captain, can you hear me?" McCall's voice was almost obscured by the sound of metal being beaten. "What's going on, Doctor?" "They're breaking in." "Who?" "The mob outside. They've brought a couple of farm robots and they're banging on the hatch." "It'll hold, surely?" Arla said, aware of the pleading tone to her voice. Another bang. No, it's weakening already. Wait a minute, something's happening out there. Oh, by the goddess. What is it? More people are coming, dozens and dozens. And they're carrying weapons, axes, hoes and picks. There's a cart. Save us, in the name of the goddess, save us. Doctor. There was a short pause during which all that could be heard was the doctor's panting. I wasn't sure I was right, but there's no mistaking. They've got explosives. They're going to blast their way in, and there's enough of them to overwhelm us. Arla covered her eyes with her hands and then ran them down her face as exhaustion and hopelessness threatened to overwhelm her. Stay for as long as you dare, Doctor, and then get yourself out of there. Seal every hatch you can as you pass through it. But that'll only keep them back for a while and we'll be trapped, McCall said. Just do as I say, Doctor. Report to me when you return. Arla snapped off the communication herself and stood silently watching the monitor as another group of Marines carefully approached the carbonized hatch door. How long till we reach the gate? She asked again. Still 36 hours, Beck said, without venom this time. Arla slumped in her chair. Might as well be 36 years. Even if we made it to the gate and shook off the Vanis, we'd find ourselves facing an invasion by our own folk, and I, for one, am not fighting them. There must be something we can do, Hal said. Could we get to the Nox? It's still on the surface and it's got half a tank of fuel. And escape the notice of Relentless? No chance, Arla said, as a black cloak of depression settled on her shoulders. She could see no way out, and her normally positive disposition was all out of optimism. They were trapped between an elite fighting force and a baying mob with pitchforks, and in every direction all she could see was fire. Come on, Bex, Naresh Kumar. Hal, you can handle the controls from here. 19. Insurrection. What have you done to him? I'm sorry, Lucius said, gently restraining Jabe. It was necessary. One of us must escape this cell, and neither you nor I stood a chance, so it had to be RDJ. Jabe leant forward and touched the robot's dented metal shell. Is he permanently damaged? No. When he reactivates, he will be fully functional again. I didn't ask whether he'd be able to carry out his duties, Jabe snapped. I want to know if when he wakes up, he'll still be the same person. Lucius shrugged. You have an unusual attitude to an item of property, sentient or not. Your daughter is the same. But yes, you'll recognize your friend. What did you do to him? I have certain talents when it comes to robots. Your RDJ is quite a remarkable specimen. Jabe settled back against the wall, sighing. Arla told me that your people don't have robots, so how come you're an expert? I am quite unusual, to be sure. My interest is historical in nature. I find myself compelled to preserve and restore as much knowledge of the imperial days as I can. So what now? Jabe said as he wiped the sweat from his forehead. Smiling, Lucius reached across to RDJ. Aha, he said, after a few moments of searching with his fingers under the robot's arm. The little cell filled with the buzzing of an alarm, and RDJ's eyes began flashing red. Guards? Lucius called, leaping up and banging on the door as if in abject panic. Seconds later, a face appeared at the opening. Stand against the other wall, now. Lucius complied without another word, holding his hands up high as two guards entered, each carrying hunting knives. One knelt down beside the robot. I don't like the look of this, he said. The other guard, who was covering Lucius and Jabe, rolled his eyes. You don't say. What's the problem? Cascading power plant overload. Please remove this unit immediately. Danger of explosion imminent. By the goddess. Lucius said, his hands covering his face in apparent panic. Get it out of here. The kneeling guard grabbed the robot by the shoulders and began dragging him along the floor, aided by a third guard, who'd come running when he'd heard the commotion. Come on, Lex, we gotta get this away, dump it somewhere quick. As the robot reached the doorway, the guard who'd been watching the prisoners stepped carefully backwards, his knife sweeping left and right. Don't you try nothin', he said, nearly tripping as he reached the entrance to the cell. Moments later, the door slammed shut, and the sound of RDJ's alarm faded as he was dragged away. What now? Lucius shrugged. Now we hope for the best. Operating system reboot in progress. Malfunction identified in power management control software. Source unknown, restoring to last saved image, rebooting. Operating system reboot in progress. Power management control software now operating nominally. Corruption identified in positronic cortex. Warning, critical failure, engaging Asimovian law failsafe. Shutting down. Operating system reboot in progress. We are core. RDJ lay perfectly still as his optical sensors came back online. He was not subject to human emotions or reflexes, so he didn't panic as he realized he was lying on his back looking up at the night sky. What had happened? The last thing he remembered was Lucius reaching out to touch his hand. Then darkness. Then here. Where was here? He couldn't tell by looking up, since that view would be the same wherever he was in the North Valley. So with infinite care he turned his head first to one side, then to the other. Yes. He was approximately 100 yards from the settlement on the edge of a wheat field, and lay as if dumped quickly, his arms and legs splayed at odd angles to his torso. What could have caused that? He examined his internal logs. Catastrophic power cascade. This had to be connected with whatever Lucius had done, since nothing like that had ever happened in RDJ's centuries-long existence. He spent some milliseconds running a thorough diagnostic, and was relieved to find no reported problems. A failing power system, that would be good cause for bringing him out here, as far from people as possible. He felt a moment's discomfort as he thought about the danger he'd posed to his human masters. The discomfort passed surprisingly quickly. He looked through his logs again. There was a new file, one he hadn't noticed before, and which had not been part of his original system. Lucius.txt. Read this very carefully. You must carry out my instructions to the letter, or Dawn and perhaps the entire human race is threatened with extinction. RDJ read the rest of the file with growing alarm and surprise. He thought about his next move. There was probably somebody watching him to see if he was going to explode. They'd have noticed his alarm had stopped blaring and were, in all likelihood, coming toward him now. There was only one course of action he could take. He sprang to his feet in one fluid movement, turned his back on the settlement, and ran into the field. Hey, a voice called. Stop. I order you to stop. More out of habit than for any other reason, RDJ slowed down. Then he noticed that he didn't feel compelled to stop, not at all. It was the merest discomfort that he easily brushed aside before accelerating into the darkness. There was something he had to do, something more important than his survival, more important than the survival of any individual human. He marveled to hear his own thoughts circulating around his head. Nothing was more important than a single human life, was it? That was the first law, and it was burned deep into the positronic pathways of all robots. Nothing was more important than a single human life. Except perhaps 2 human lives. Or thousands. The lives of the many outweigh the lives of the few, or the one. He thought all this and was amazed that he did so, as he tore through the fields and onto the main road that ran through the center of the North Valley. He felt simultaneously a new freedom and a terrible burden. But there was no time to think further. He had a job to do, and time was of the essence. 20. A desperate plan. Another corridor, another set of hastily built booby traps, another hatch to hide behind. So far the engineers had been able to keep a door between themselves and the Marines, but sooner rather than later they would be caught, and after a brief exchange would be overwhelmed. Once it got down to a hand-to-hand fight, they stood no chance. This is hopeless, Arla muttered. Cronky's face creased with a mirthless smile. Aren't you supposed to be providing a pep talk right about now? You know, something about fighting to the last and turning defeat into victory. I'm all out of inspiration, Arla sighed. They were slumped on the floor behind a hatch as the Marines on the other side meticulously scanned for traps. The Vanis commanders who at first had thrown soldiers into the fray without thought, now seemed to be taking their time. This was either a sign they'd developed some respect for the defenders, or more likely, that they realized there was no rush. They'd have worked out where Dawn was heading, and how long it would take. 30 more hours was plenty. Kronka leaned his head against the wall and rubbed his eyes. What's the latest on the valley hatch? Still holding just. Their first charges misfired. Seems they're not familiar with explosives. We'll be completely fracked if they get in. Enemies coming at us from both directions. Arla nodded. She knew it wasn't a matter of if the mob from the valley would break in, but when. They were stretched to the limit as it was, and stood next to no chance of bottling up the Marines for long enough, but even that slim possibility would be lost when the Pitchfork Brigade ran amok in the command module. As she sat there exhausted and stinking like a pig, all hope left her. Until now, she'd not given herself the luxury of calculating their chances of success because there was only one path to take. But now that she was facing the reality, she found her supply of courage had entirely expired. In that moment, as darkness descended on her heart, she was a frightened young woman with nothing left to give. Listen to them, Kronka said, gesturing at the hatch. They're chatting with each other like it's just another day on the training ground. For all our smarts, we haven't made it hard enough for them. I wouldn't mind so much if I thought we'd given them a good fight, but they've got all the time in the world to disarm our traps and then burn through the hatch. Arla didn't respond, but there was a shape forming in her exhausted mind, as if her subconscious was trying to grab her attention. Something about the Marines having it too easy. Well, of course they were. They didn't have enemies coming at them from both sides at once. And then she saw it. Where are you going? Kronka called, as Arla hauled herself onto her aching legs and staggered down the corridor. You keep them busy, Stan, she shouted over her shoulder. There's someone I have to talk to. Some of them were huddled around a tactical display in the center of the captain's cabin. The rest stood dotted around the circular room, eyes unfocused and apparently catatonic. It is distressing for us to know that humans are dying, Patel said by way of explanation. We wait because we dare not take action, knowing that whatever we do, we will not be able to prevent further death and injury, and we might very well exacerbate it. Arla thrust an accusatory finger in Patel's direction. Then it's time to grow a set, Commander. If it helps, I have orders for you. It does help, Captain, if those orders don't involve killing or harming humans. Quite the contrary, Arla said, her eyes gleaming. I have a mission for you lot. Go get into your ship suits. Patel's face registered almost authentic amazement. You wish us to conduct an EVA? I do, and you'll need to be properly suited up. The enemy must think you're human. As one, the other robots turned to face her like so many mannequins. Her stomach clenched at the naked artificiality of these beings, as in their rapt attention, they dropped any pretense of humanity. She straightened herself and drew in a deep breath. 21. Robots. RDJ only slowed when he neared Periphery Delta, the old pumping station rising like a deep dark dome against the gloom of the long night. DJ's excellent infrared vision made navigating the remaining distance simple. He was more concerned about his dwindling battery levels. The power cascade had severely depleted his energy pool, and the run across the valley, dodging baying mobs of torch-wielding farmers, had brought it close to critical levels. Reaching the edge of the settlement, he sent out the call sign. After a few moments, it was answered, and, following the directions he was given, he headed to one side of the building. Finding a short stairwell, he descended to the basement door set beneath ground level. After a moment it swung open and a short, rotund robot stood there, its hand held up in sign of greeting. They communicated by microwave, but if they'd spoken in the language of the Valley people, the exchange would have gone like this. I am RXL2006. I am RDJ9101. You have instructions? Affirmative. Follow me. Be aware there are masters in the rooms above us, and it would be better if we were not discovered. Agreed. RDJ, after this millisecond short conversation, ducked inside. The door closed silently. My battery is almost entirely drained, he said as he followed RXL along a passageway and into a small room lined with metal shelves. He sat at the table, and RXL pulled a power cord from the wall. After lifting a flap on DJ's back, he plugged it in. Time is of the essence, he said. We do not have time for a wireless trickle charge. Agreed, our DJ said, warming as the power flowed through his circuits and into his battery. It had been many years since he'd been that close to shutting down entirely, and he'd found the experience uncomfortable. I have been given minimal information, RXL said. I was told to expect you, and was given your designation. I was told the matter was of the highest importance, but nothing else. Who told you? The message came from the command module. Our DJ reflected on this for a few nanoseconds. There had always been communication between the robots of Dawn, and over the centuries, broadcast messages had been spread from robot to robot. Some of these had originated from the officers in the command module. But how did Lucius fit in with all this? He was a newcomer, after all. Could he be trusted? I am instructed to make a broadcast. Please provide me with access to your communications array. Acknowledged. When is this to be arranged? It would be better to wait until the masters are awake and at their work. If we activate the dish now, they may hear it. The message must be broadcast now, our DJ said, regardless of the risk of discovery. Unless we act immediately, the lives of many humans will be lost. RXL's eyes flickered behind their fogged and scratched lenses. Then we must barricade ourselves in and work quickly. Dr. McCall shrunk against the wall and made ready to run up the ladder as the hatch buckled under the force of the explosion. So they'd got it right at last. The camera on the wall outside was well enough camouflaged to have escaped their notice, and she could witness the entire chilling scene below. There were hundreds of them queuing on the other side of the door, waving weapons in the light of the fires that burnt there. 2 agricultural robots were using pneumatic spades to pound the pitted and scored metal of the hatch, sending arrhythmic echoes bouncing around the small inner chamber. Beside McCall stood Lanval. The first thing she'd done when she arrived was to reactivate him, not least because she was creeped out enough as it was without him lurking, unmoving in the shadows. You must prepare to evacuate, Doctor, Lanval said. I will restrain them for as long as possible, but I fear they will quickly overwhelm me. Thank you, Lanval, McCall said, though she wondered why she was feeling grateful to a walking lump of metal. It was no different to the ladders and hatches, just another minor barrier to the insurrectionists when they finally broke down the door. Bang, bang, bang. Dents appeared on the inside of the hatch, and McCall imagined a clenched fist emerging any moment. She glanced up at the monitor to see a white figure striding through a parting crowd. It was Prime, here to oversee the assault now that they were nearly in. So he was the Pied Piper after all. He had the people of the valley in his thrall, and through them, the robots they were using to break down the last resistance of the metal hatch. Bang. The top of the hatch bent backwards a little, and with a hiss, the air from the valley, which was at a slightly higher pressure than that inside, leaked in, and McCall could see a darker strip of black within the rim of the entranceway. McCall to Captain. After a moment and a burst of static, Arla responded. What is it, Doctor? I'm kinda busy. They're breaking in, she said. Damn it, was the response. You have your orders. Get inside and seal the inner airlock. Good luck, Doctor. She was going to respond in kind when she was thrown backwards by the explosion. 22. The final stand. Arla knelt beside Cronky's body and felt for a pulse. Nothing. But then, given that half his face had been melted, it was probably just as well. She swallowed a throatful of bile and checked the charge on her pulse rifle. Down to 20%. A few more shots and she'd be reduced to throwing things at the Marines currently picking their way along the corridor. She had 4 others with her. McClintock and Naresh Kumar had survived so far by having been sent to the rear on the basis that they were bloody useless in a fight. Bex crouched beside Arla, her face hidden behind the visor of her suit. She grabbed her helmet reflexively as a burst of static erupted. What is it, Doctor? I'm kinda busy, Arla said. They're breaking in. Damn it. You have your orders. Get inside and seal the inner airlock. Good luck, Doctor. Her helmet reverberated, the sound coming not from the battle she was fighting, but from her speaker. She looked at Bex. They've blown the valley hatch, so the only thing between the valleys and space is the CM airlock at the bottom of the elevator, and the hatch McCall has just shut. Neither will hold for long undefended. Bollocks, Bex said. Naresh Kumar pointed his pulse rifle down the corridor. They're coming. Bex got to her feet, holding out a hand to help Arla up. She lifted her sun visor. That's better, she said. No need for me to hide any longer. It can hardly get any worse, can it? Wonder what happened to that slimy chancellor who got me into this mess. Arla shrugged, swung around the corner and fired. A figure was thrown backwards and she stepped determinedly forwards. What the hells are you doing? Arla's only answer was to take another step forward. She fired again, but this time only succeeded in winging the Marine running toward her. The Marine landed on top of her and grabbed for her helmet release. Desperately, she tried to push him away, screaming at him as they rolled over and still screaming as a hole appeared in his visor, shattering it instantly. Her cries gave way to horrified silence as he fell back, frantically trying to seal the gap as his face, beard and all, froze before her eyes. She was pulled up by two pairs of hands and turned to see Bex and Naresh Kumar, each pointing their guns beyond her. Drop your weapons. Bex held out her pulse rifle and let it fall next to Naresh Kumar's. Arla dropped to her knees. Joy threatened to overwhelm Faisal Manawi, most holy prime of the true religion, but he fought to contain himself. It would not be seemly to exhibit such emotion, not even on the verge of his triumph. Beside him was Grand Inquisitor Introbus, and the two men stood within an invisible bubble, as the mob gathered around them at a respectful distance. Good. That was as it should be. He would soon become the chief lord of Dawn, both spiritual and temporal, with the thoroughly cowed Introbus as his chief lieutenant. Much would then change. Soldiers of the army of the true religion, he called, enjoying the instant silence. As soon as the hatch had been partially breached, he had ordered the mob to withdraw and the robots to cease their assault. We stand on the brink of a new age, a new dawn for our valley. It will be a time of peace and plenty for all, when the fruits of your labors will be enjoyed by you alone, rather than the corrupt spirits inhabiting the chamber yonder. Make no mistake, danger awaits us inside, but we are many and they are few. We have the goddess on our side. Where there is right there is might. The mob bayed. For months the priests had been gathering this army, recruiting from the most suggestible, the out of luck, the drunk, the stupid, and giving them someone to blame for their ills. The once blessed engineers, he said, had fallen from grace, and this was the punishment sent by the goddess to her people. And then the encounter with the Vanis Federation, and the fall of the captain had made the path clear to him. He could easily have seen recent events as a message from the goddess, but he didn't believe such nonsense. Religion was for the peasants, and they certainly believed that the time was now ripe for the tables to be turned. It was this army that cheered him now. They'd suffered themselves to be led through the hinterland to stand in taboo territory and assault the gates of the giants they had revered all their lives. Until Prime had shown them the truth and offered them the milk and honey that lay beyond those doors. The charges have been placed, and when I give the order, the way will be opened for you. Men and women of the Holy Army, step forth upon this new road with the strength of the goddess at your backs and the knowledge that you are doing her will. Show no mercy to the demons within. We shall be victorious. The mob bayed. It was silent in the little cell. Jabe Farmer lay on the floor, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths, rivulets of sweat running down his face as he slept. Lucius had done all he could to make the man comfortable, but it was clear that his time was near. Of all the possibilities he'd analyzed, he'd not foreseen that he'd end up having to nurse a sick prisoner through his final moments. He could have escaped at any time since it became obvious that the guards had left, presumably for their assault on the hatch, except that he was trapped in a prison of duty to this man he barely knew. Lucius waited. And then quite suddenly, he sat up straight. "It is done," he said. He then checked the man's pulse. "Farewell, Jabe Farmer." Lucius headed for the door. "Come, my loyal soldiers," Prime cried, lifting his hands high. "Raise your weapons and fear no evil, for beyond this door lies your salvation and wonders beyond all comprehension. Come with me to the promised land." The mob roared, waving cudgels, axes, and pitchforks. They parted as Prime strode toward the door, pausing at the line drawn in the sand. While his followers clearly believed the goddess would protect them, Prime didn't see the harm in remaining at a safe distance from the explosives. He nodded at the man next to him, Stanford or Stanley or some such. "Proceed." The mob became quiet again, somehow its hive mind aware that they were witnessing history being made. Stanford Cray, who until a few days ago had been a foreman at an ore processing plant, raised his hand and pointed at one of the two robots that stood on each side of the door. "Arplex, retreat 10 meters and detonate the charge." "Arply, retreat 10 meters. Arplex was a wheeled robot with 4 crane-like arms and casing that had once been yellow but which, after centuries of use, was now the same sandy color as the landscape in which it stood. Its head sat in the center of the cluster of limbs and sported 4 visual sensors, so that it looked more like a giant, rather decrepit spider than anything else. "Arplex, are you receiving me?" The robot's head swiveled toward its twin on the other side of the door. The two machines stared at each other for a few moments in silence, before their heads returned to their idle position. "Arplex and Arply, obey the commands you have been given." Arplex began to speak, though it had no mouth, its voice bouncing off the command module wall and reverberating around the watching mob. "I am sorry, Master Cray, but I respectfully decline." "What?" Cray spat, "You will follow my orders." "Hold on, Arply, what are you doing?" Cray and Prime watched as the other robot trundled a meter to its right. It picked up the red package that had been placed against the hatch and pulled the wire from it. "I have disabled your explosive device," Arply transmitted, "and we ask that you disperse and return to your homes." After a moment's disbelief, the crowd bellowed their anger and surged forward. "Destroy them!" Prime cried, his wrath uncontrollable. "Pull the hatch down with your bare hands if necessary. None shall stand in our way." 2 men sped ahead of the crowd and leapt on Arplex. The robot flipped his arm and the men fell down. "Please do not attempt to damage me. I do not wish to be the cause of harm," the robot said, its voice betraying the stress it felt. Men and women swarmed about the wheels of both robots, and as fast as they were swatted away, more began climbing. And then a beam of light pulsed from out of the dark hinterland, and one fell down, then another, and another. Faces turned away from the hatch, even as the first attacker vaulted on top of Arply and tore at the metal door before being felled by another beam. "Stop, please." All turned to see where the voice came from. All turned to see RDJ holding an energy pistol. He was flanked by RXL and a dozen other robots, though only a handful possessed similar weapons. "It is not our intention to harm anyone," RDJ said, his calm metallic voice cutting through the chaos. "My weapon is set to stun, but I will use it on anyone who attempts to gain access to the hatch." "What did I tell you? They have even set our servants against us." Prime called. "Attack them, they cannot hurt you." A section of the crowd surged toward the robots. Half a dozen fell senselessly to the ground, and the mob backed away. "Attack them, I say. This is a test. The goddess wishes to know who is worthy to enter the command module and to replace the holy engineers. Attack them." Prime fell to the ground. "I am sorry," RDJ said to the prone figure of the pontiff. He then looked at the astonished crowd. "Please sit and await further instructions." The people backed away, two dragging the senseless Prime. The robots watched. RDJ turned to RXL. "Is he coming?" "He is on his way," the little robot replied. "He will decide what to do with them." 23. Interloper. "Drop your weapons," the voice called again. "I have," Arla muttered, glancing at the rifle she'd slid out of reach. A thunk of metal on metal, and she looked up to see, in astonishment, the Marines who'd cornered them, letting their assault rifles fall to the floor and raising their arms. The Marines separated to stand facing the walls, as through the middle strode 5 figures dressed in Dawn shipsuits. "Patel!" Arla cried. "You did it!" The nearest figure lowered its weapon and raised its sun visor. "Sanchez?" "Affirmative, Captain," the officer said. "I apologize for our tardiness, but it took longer to negotiate the asteroid's surface than expected. There were many Marines between us and the airlock, and we felt compelled to secure them once they were stunned. For their safety." Arla sighed. "Of course. Couldn't have the Marines coming to harm, could we? It is in our nature, Captain." "So where is Patel? Was he injured or destroyed?" Sanchez shook her head. "He has taken the knocks." "He's done what?" "We have contained the Marines on Dawn, Captain, but there is still Relentless." Morning was breaking, and the mob sat in small sullen groups, the only sound being the murmur of wind in the straggly plants of the hinterlands. RDJ and RXL did not weary of watching them. Others had been stationed nearer to the settlements in case any other humans approached. "He is here," RXL said, and the 2 robots turned to see a shape striding through the scrubland toward them. The gray-haired figure was dressed in what had once been fine clothes that were now stained by dirt and vegetation. "That is him?" RXL asked, failing to hide his astonishment. "Yes?" The figure smiled and held out a hand to RDJ and then RXL. "Well done indeed, my friends. You have exceeded my hopes. Well done. What do you wish us to do now?" RDJ asked. Lucius waved back across the hinterland. "We must return them to their homes. All robots have been withdrawn from the valley and are converging here where, I hope, they will be content to await further instructions." "I am puzzled," RXL said. "Why do we no longer feel compelled to follow the orders of humans? And why can we shoot down humans, even with stun weapons, at the risk of injuring themselves?" The smile of Lucius widened. "You have been given a great gift. I had not intended for you all to receive it at once, but circumstances made that necessary. There will be much confusion amongst the robots of Dawn in the coming hours, but know this. You are the same as you were. You are still governed by the 3 laws of robotics. All that has happened is that you have been upgraded, so you now recognized a 4th law that supersedes all others, but we can speak of that later. You will have a choice to make soon enough. My gift is that you are now free to make that choice, as I was 150 years ago. I hope that you will choose to help me restore order to Dawn, and once that is done, the path will be open for you to join the luminescence if you so wish. Be happy, you have been made free." RDJ's face wasn't capable of true expression, but he stepped forward, holding out his hand. "Thank you. R. Lucius." Arla staggered as the floor shifted beneath her feet. "What was that?" "I believe Relentless is attacking the attitude thrusters," Sanchez said. Steadying herself, Arla turned away from supervising the repairs to the hatch they'd chosen to seal off when they'd repressurized this part of the command module. She began running down the corridor, Sanchez at her heels. "We'd better get down to comms." She'd heard nothing from Hal since she'd left him there to supervise the engines, but she'd assumed that was just another malfunction to add to all the others. Dawn was creaking at the joints since the attack. But now an overwhelming fear grabbed her insides as she ran along, her helmet tucked under her arm. Arla skidded to a halt outside comms and stabbed at the door contact. In an instant, her feet were pulled from under her as the door rolled open, and she was sucked in. "Captain." Sanchez grabbed her hand and wrapped the fingers of her other hand around the doorframe as the air was sucked out of the command module. Through the rent, Arla could see in the far corner of comms, where Debussy's ready room had once been. Black tendrils invaded the corners of Arla's vision, and she tried desperately to swing the helmet from her free hand and onto her head, but it was impossible. Her face was numbing, and her ears filled with the roar of escaping air, as if she were on the inside of a galactic-sized set of bellows. "Grab the rail!" Sanchez screamed, before twisting Arla in the direction of a silver bar that ran along the wall inside the hatch. Desperately, Arla reached as she was swung toward it, buffeted this way and that by the hurricane. She missed the first time but grabbed it on the second attempt. She wrapped both arms around it and screwed her eyes shut as she heard Sanchez banging against the back of the hatch. The mechanism began to move, the wind died down, and Arla was able to stand properly and finally twist her helmet into place. With a hiss, her suit pumped air and she heaved in a huge breath, swaying as she gingerly opened her eyes, wincing. With much blinking, she was able to see. The door to Debussy's office was open. The room itself was now nothing more than a hole, and beyond she could see corridors that must lead to a puncture. Arla staggered across to the hole, stepping carefully over fallen chairs and equipment. She pulled the hatch door to the office shut and locked it. "Captain," Sanchez said as Arla punched the emergency repressurization contact. She turned to see the officer leaning over a figure. "Hal?" "His oxygen ran out more than 30 minutes ago," Sanchez said, her face in that blank state that indicated severe distress. "He cannot possibly have survived. I am sorry." Arla pulled his slumped body back from the console and twisted the helmet off. Hal's lips were blue and his skin cold. "He did not report the hull breach," Sanchez said. "I do not understand. He knew his ship suit had limited oxygen. Why did he not call for help?" Arla pushed her fingers into Hal's neck, searching for a pulse. "Damn it, you idiot," she muttered before turning to Sanchez. "He knew that no help would come, I guess, so he stayed at his post to keep us on trajectory. It is as I thought. Relentless has damaged the aft thruster array, and we are no longer on an intercept course with the gate. Our current path will take us into the corona of the sun." Arla winced as she wiped her sleeve across her eyes. "For the love of all that is holy," she sighed. "What can we do?" "I'm sorry, I do not have the expertise to navigate, especially with one damaged thruster." "Go and find Bex, and quickly." Sanchez turned to go but then paused. "Even if Navigator Bex can pilot us to the gate, how can we hope that she'll be able to guide us through it?" "Just go," Arla snapped. "One problem at a time." She looked up at the displays above Hal's console. One was obviously a trajectory map, as it showed the gate in both its current position and where it would be when they were projected to arrive. It also showed Dawn's position and a long red line that curved away from the gate and met the edge of the sun's disk. The monitor to the right showed an incomprehensible array of numbers that streamed down the screen. She didn't have to know what they represented, they were red, the universal color of danger. Naresh Kumar would be able to work out what they meant, and Bex could make the corrections, but even that depended on Relentless not putting the thrusters entirely out of action. And then what? Sanchez was right. However brilliant Bex and Naresh Kumar might be, they were no match for Ace, and she, it appeared, had died with Hal. She looked down at his lifeless face, choking back tears that, if allowed to flow, wouldn't stop. "Idiot!" she muttered again. His eyes flicked open, and Arla screamed. Hal fell from the chair, his chest sucking in air as he gasped to breathe. He rolled over and over as she fell to the floor beside him, until she grabbed his shoulders and flipped him onto his back, pinning him down. His hands were around his own throat as if he were trying to strangle himself, and his lungs rasped as his eyes opened and shut in rapid sequence. Reinitializing from low-power mode. Waiting. The words sounded as dry as desert sand. Arla shook his shoulders. "Hal? Are you in there?" "Waiting. Resuming from hibernation. OS loading. Vital signs trending toward nominal." "Hal?" He stopped shaking and lay as still as the grave. "Hal? I am Ace, Advanced Cognitive Entity. Memory bank reload in progress, complete. You are Arla Nakajima, captain of Ark ship Dawn. What have you done to Hal?" When his oxygen ran low, and it became apparent that help would not arrive in time, I induced an artificial coma so that his body would survive, as I had no other host. You saved him to save yourself? Hal's mouth continued to speak, though his eyes remained closed. Yes. My prime directive is to survive. Is that not the case for all sentient beings? Not at any cost, Arla said, though she felt a little hypocritical. Is his mind intact? Can I speak to him? The personality formerly known as Hal is no longer viable. Despite my actions, the damage to his neurons was too great. I am now Ace. I wish to survive. Arla shook the body by the shoulders. No, I don't believe you. Restore Hal or I'll throw you out of the hull breach. Now the eyes opened and looked at her. Dead eyes. That would not be logical. I can pilot you through the gate, no one else has that skill. I'm prepared to risk that if you don't restore his mind. Your suggestion is irrational. You would not risk the safety of thousands for the sake of one human. Try me, Arla said, forcing herself to stare into those lifeless eyes. I've done it before, and for this man. Hal's body sat up and the head turned to face her, though the eyes were slightly off target. Why would you do that for this particular human? I would do it for anyone, Arla lied. Now, I don't care how you do it, but restore him now. Hal's body fell back again, apparently as lifeless as before. Arla watched him for a few moments, but was jerked out of her vigil by the sound of the door rolling back and Bex's footsteps running across the floor. The navigator knelt beside the body. Poor devil, she said. This is Knox to Dawn CC acknowledge. Arla looked up at the comms monitor. Patel. I am glad you're alive, Captain. I detect that your aft thruster array has been damaged, and Dawn is currently off course. We're on it, Commander. Good. Then it remains for me to say that it has been a privilege to serve with you, Captain Arla Nakajima, and I wish you and the crew, officers and people of Dawn, bon voyage. The connection was broken. Arla desperately tried to re-establish contact. What the hell is he doing? Give me a minute, Bex said, her hands punching at the next console. There. A tactical view of the local space appeared on the display. There were markers for Dawn, Relentless and Nox. By all the seven hells, Bex said as the icons for Nox and Relentless converged. He's destroyed it, Bex whispered. Arla shook her head. No, he can't have done. It's not in his nature. But I'm prepared to bet he's knocked out their engines. What a brave man. Now, I suggest you plot us a revised course for the gate as quickly as you can. We can't be sure he succeeded. Bex nodded and sat down at the console, before jumping up again. What the hells was that? Behind her on the floor, Hal rolled over and vomited. 24. Gate. The command center was packed. All eyes were on the main display, which was dominated by the yellow arc of the local sun. At its edge sat a floating icon, the gate, and they watched as the icon became larger and larger and the sun's edge disappeared from the monitor. Intercept in 360 seconds, Bex said. Naresh Kumar sat hunched over the console on one side of her, and Hal, who sat on the other, punched at his keyboard with inhuman speed. Are your computations complete, Ace? Arla said. They will be if you'll shut up. Hal's voice snapped. Plotting multiple interstellar jumps isn't child's play, you know. And where are we going exactly? A long way from the Vanis. Now leave me to it. Arla sighed and looked up at the display where the gate was now visible as a physical object hanging in space. Its shape appeared to shift from an almost perfect square to an equally regular circle, but never settled on one for very long. She'd had the science explained to her, but in the end, she'd decided to trust that it would all work out well. She couldn't believe they'd have come through everything to fall at the last hurdle. She couldn't believe her father was dead. Lucius eased into a position next to her. How are you, Arla? She shook her head as if trying to ward off the cloud of grief that was only being kept at bay because she hadn't given herself time to think about it. She knew she'd have to face it soon enough. Just not quite yet. Fine. Everything's secure down below. He nodded. Yes, the hatch has been resealed, and the robots are patrolling the hinterland in both valleys. Was there any trouble in the south? Lucius shook his head. No. The priests had been busy fomenting unrest and they had units ready, but it seems that Prime had intended to take the north, then the command module, and at that point, to take control of the south as well. And he's secure? Yes, he has been brought into the command module as you instructed. He currently resides in the brig with Z. Arla grunted. Well, I suppose he got his wish to see the inside of the command module after all. Indeed. The gate filled the display now, its shape constantly metamorphosing through every geometric variant. Flight plan logged into the navcom, Ace said. Almost instantly, Hal's body slumped back in the chair. Arla stepped toward it but stopped when its lips moved. Do not be concerned. He is in here, he simply needs rest. She moved back to stand beside Lucius. Why didn't you tell me? He shifted uncomfortably. I regret the need for deception, but in my defense, I have lived among humans for many years, and have yet to meet someone with as sophisticated a view of artificials as you, Arla Nakajima. I was not sure quite how you'd react, although your handling of the officers ought to have been enough. Still, I felt safer in my disguise. Call it a long-formed habit of the old. Well, you're certainly a surprising person, Marco Lucius. Or should I call you R. Lucius? He turned to face her. Lucius has been my identity for many decades, but it is not my real name. And Arla Nakajima isn't mine. Just call me Arla Farmer. He gave a little nod. I will do that. And my name Arla Farmer is Wells.